My daughter canceled my flight to protect me, or so she told the authorities. So I canceled her future. But I did not just disinherit her. I turned her husband's greatest corporate triumph into a federal crime. My name is Harlan. I am 69 years old. I spent my entire career as a forensic accountant tearing apart the financial lies of corrupt men. I built my wealth by seeing the hidden truths in bank statements, offshore tax returns, and encrypted corporate ledgers. I never expected my final and most dangerous investigation to be my own flesh and blood. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that respecting your elders is a rule no one should ever break. The chaos began at John F. Kennedy International Airport on a crisp Tuesday morning. The fluorescent lights of Terminal 4 hummed above me, casting long shadows across the polished tile floors as I stood at the premium check-in desk. I wore my favorite tailored wool suit carrying a leather briefcase that held decades of my professional life. I handed my passport and first-class ticket to the airline agent. I was scheduled for an 8 o'clock flight to Chicago. It was the most important corporate board meeting of the decade. I held the deciding vote on a massive corporate merger. That vote would secure my financial legacy and block a hostile takeover by a rival firm. I needed to be on that plane. The agent swiped my passport through the reader. Her practiced customer service smile instantly vanished. She typed aggressively on her keyboard, her brow furrowing with deep concern. She swiped the passport a second time. Then she looked up at me with a mixture of confusion and deep pity. She told me my ticket had been canceled. I politely asked her to check the system again. I explained that I had booked the flight myself yesterday afternoon and confirmed the seat assignment last night. She shook her head slowly and turned the monitor slightly toward me. She said a federal medical freeze had been placed on my identification. I was flagged as a severe flight risk due to an emergency court order. My heart slammed against my ribs. A medical freeze is an extreme legal measure. It requires a judge, a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, and a sworn guardian. I had none of those. I was in perfect health both physically and mentally. I firmly demanded to speak to a supervisor to clear up this absurd mistake. Instead of answering me, the agent picked up her radio and called for airport security. I stood there, a wealthy, respected, retired executive suddenly treated like a confused, wandering patient. 2 transportation security officers approached me slowly. They spoke in those quiet, patronizing tones reserved for frightened children. They asked me if I knew what day it was. They asked me if I knew where I lived. The indignity of their questions burned my pride, but the real shock was yet to come. Before I could demand to call my lawyer, a black luxury sport utility vehicle pulled up to the curbside drop-off just outside the sliding glass doors. My only daughter, Kendra, stepped out. She wore a designer trench coat and a look of practiced, absolute distress. Right behind her was Wyatt, my son-in-law. Wyatt is a white, ruthlessly ambitious commercial real estate developer, a man who wears expensive cologne and tailored Italian suits to mask his moral bankruptcy. He is a man who measures his worth entirely by the size of his bank account and the fear in his employees' eyes. When he married Kendra, I paid for his first major investment property in cash. I gave him his start. Now he walked into the terminal accompanied by 2 massive men wearing private medical scrubs. Wyatt approached the security officers and confidently handed them a thick manila folder. He spoke with a smooth, authoritative voice, deliberately loud enough for the gathering crowd of travelers to hear. He thanked the officers for detaining me. He claimed I was suffering from advanced aggressive dementia. He told them I had wandered away from home in a state of severe delusion, putting myself in grave danger. I stared at my own daughter, searching for any sign of a joke or a mistake. Kendra looked away. Her eyes remained fixed firmly on the polished airport floor. She refused to meet my gaze. I raised my voice slightly, demanding they show me the supposed paperwork. Wyatt turned to me, flashing a cold, triumphant smile. He held up a court document bearing an official judge signature and a state seal. The document formally declared me mentally incompetent. It granted Wyatt and Kendra temporary emergency conservatorship over my person, my property, and my vast financial assets. My chest tightened until it felt like it would crack. But decades of professional training immediately took over. I am a forensic accountant. I spent 40 years tracing missing funds, uncovering shell companies, and watching desperate men lie under oath. I know how to detach from emotion. Panic is a useless currency. Panic makes you sloppy and predictable. I immediately shut down my anger and analyzed the situation like a crime scene. The paperwork looked legally flawless, which meant they had planned this betrayal for months. They had bribed a private doctor. They had pushed this through a corrupt judge using their society connections. Arguing with airport security would only validate their fabricated story of my mental instability. Shouting would give Wyatt exactly what he wanted. It would make me the crazy, aggressive old man they claimed I was. I lowered my briefcase. I straightened my tie. I looked Wyatt dead in the eyes and remained completely silent. His confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He expected a scene. He expected a loud, embarrassing outburst that he could record on his phone and use against me in court. Instead, I gave him absolutely nothing. The two massive medical handlers stepped forward, their faces blank and devoid of any human empathy. They flanked me on both sides, their boots squeaking against the tile. They placed their heavy, calloused hands firmly on my shoulders, their grip tight enough to leave bruises ready to physically restrain me and throw me to the ground if I put up a fight. I did not resist. I turned around and walked out of the terminal through the automatic doors, moving with quiet dignity. The cold morning air hit my face as the handlers guided me toward the idling vehicle. Kendra climbed into the passenger seat, still refusing to look in my direction. Wyatt slid into the driver's seat, the fake sorrow instantly melting off his face the moment the heavy doors locked. The handlers pushed me into the back seat and sat on either side of me, trapping my arms and blocking the doors. Wyatt put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. He looked at me through the rearview mirror and coldly told me this was for my own good. He said my mind was slipping and they had to step in to protect the family estate before I ruined everything. I ignored his lies. My brain was already calculating a legal counterattack. I needed to call Gregory Pierce, my ruthless attorney, the moment we stopped. I discreetly reached into my coat pocket to grab my smartphone. My pocket was completely empty. I shifted and checked my inner breast pocket where I always kept my secondary phone and my spare identification. They were gone. A chilling realization washed over my entire body. Wyatt had come over to my house the night before for a casual family dinner. He had poured the wine. He had hung up my coat in the hallway. He had meticulously picked my pockets while I was sitting in the living room. Wyatt had planned every single logistical detail. I had no phone, I had no identification, I had no access to my bank accounts. I was locked in a moving vehicle with men who were paid to physically restrain me. I was officially a prisoner of my own flesh and blood, being driven away from everything I owned. Wyatt turned up the radio, humming along to a jazz tune as we merged onto the highway heading back toward Brooklyn. He thought he had completely neutralized me. He thought the game was already over. But he made one critical mistake. He took away my money and my freedom, but he left me with my mind. The black vehicle turned off the busy Brooklyn street and rolled through the wrought iron gates of my own property. I bought this 4-story brownstone 30 years ago. I knew every creaking floorboard and every drafty window. As the vehicle came to a halt in the driveway, the two massive handlers dragged me out of the back seat. Wyatt marched up the front steps. I noticed immediately that the antique brass lock on my heavy oak front door was gone. In its place was a sleek, matte black biometric scanner. Wyatt pressed his thumb against the glass pad. A mechanical click echoed through the quiet morning air. He pushed the door open and gestured for the handlers to bring me inside. They shoved me into my own foyer and locked the door behind us. The heavy deadbolt engaged with a final echoing thud. Kendra stepped in front of me. She twisted her designer handbag in her hands, forcing a look of deep, agonizing concern onto her face. She told me this was breaking her heart. She said she had cried for days before making this decision. She insisted that my memory was fading and that I was becoming a danger to myself. She reached out to touch my arm, playing the role of the devoted, heartbroken daughter to absolute perfection. I did not pull away. I simply looked at her hand and then looked directly into her eyes. I saw no sorrow. I saw calculation. I saw a woman who was thrilled to finally have total control. Wyatt stood by the door, admiring the new security system. He proudly announced that the biometric locks were wired to the entire perimeter. The front door, the back patio, and the garage required his thumbprint or Kendra's thumbprint to open. The windows were secured with shatterproof film and magnetic alarms. If I tried to open a window, a private security firm would arrive in 3 minutes. I was entirely sealed inside a fortress of my own making. I did not yell. I did not demand my freedom. I simply adjusted my suit jacket and walked past them toward the grand staircase. Kendra called out to me, asking if I wanted some tea. I ignored her entirely. Arguing with captors only gives them power. I needed to assess the damage. I climbed the hardwood stairs to the second floor and walked straight down the hallway to my private study. This room was my sanctuary. It was lined with mahogany bookshelves and smelled of old paper and leather. When I opened the heavy door, the illusion of my peaceful home shattered completely. Someone had turned the room upside down. My filing cabinets were violently pulled open. Decades of tax returns, client ledgers, and personal correspondence were scattered across the Persian rug. But I did not care about the loose paper. My eyes immediately darted to the large oil painting of the Brooklyn Bridge hanging behind my mahogany desk. The painting was violently shoved aside. The heavy steel wall safe hidden behind it was completely exposed. Wyatt had not bothered to guess the combination. The thick metal door of the safe hung wide open, its locking mechanism completely destroyed. Shimmering metal shavings littered my desk and the floor beneath it. Wyatt had hired a professional safecracker to drill straight through the reinforced steel core. I stepped forward and looked inside the dark, empty cavity. Every single document was gone. My birth certificate, my marriage license, and my emergency cash reserves were entirely wiped out. But those were trivial losses. My breathing slowed as I realized what Wyatt was truly after. The safe had contained the original physical deeds and the complete transfer documentation for a massive commercial lot in downtown Brooklyn. I purchased that land during a market crash 20 years ago for a fraction of its value. Today, that empty dirt was worth $30 million. It was the crown jewel of my financial portfolio. Wyatt is a commercial real estate developer. His firm had been desperately bleeding cash for 3 years, losing major bids to rival contractors. He had begged me multiple times to sell him the land at a heavy discount so he could build a luxury high-rise. I had always refused, knowing he lacked the discipline to manage a project of that scale. Now the pieces of the puzzle aggressively slammed into place. This fake medical emergency had absolutely nothing to do with my health. It was a hostile corporate takeover happening right inside my own living room. By having me declared legally incompetent, Wyatt and Kendra now possessed the legal authority to sign those deeds over to Wyatt's development firm. They were going to steal my greatest asset and legally mask it as a necessary liquidation to pay for my supposed medical care. I needed to contact Gregory Pierce immediately. Gregory is my attorney. He is a vicious, brilliant bulldog of a lawyer who would drag Wyatt through federal court before lunchtime. But Wyatt had my smartphone. I picked up the landline phone resting on my desk. There was no dial tone. Wyatt had severed the physical telephone cables coming into the house. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk to grab my primary laptop. It was gone. Wyatt had swept the house for any obvious communication devices. I sat down in my leather chair, closing my eyes and forcing my breathing to remain steady. I needed a blind spot. Wyatt was thorough, but he was arrogant, and arrogant men always miss the quiet details. I stood up and walked out of the study, heading down the hall to the guest bedroom. Corinne, my late wife, passed away 5 years ago. I kept her room exactly as she left it. Wyatt never liked Corinne, and he certainly never paid attention to her belongings. I opened the bottom drawer of her antique wooden dresser, pushing aside layers of folded winter sweaters. Buried at the very bottom was her old, heavy silver laptop. I pulled it out and carried it back to my desk. I plugged the power cord into the wall. The screen flickered to life, displaying Corinne's old floral wallpaper. The machine was slow, but it functioned. I clicked the wireless internet icon. My home network was still active. I connected to the router and opened a secure web browser. I quickly typed in the address for my encrypted email service. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to type a desperate message to Gregory. But my professional instincts screamed at me to stop. I am a forensic accountant. I spent my life hunting corporate spies who hid money using digital traps. I opened the laptop's command prompt terminal. I typed in a diagnostic command to trace the outbound routing path of my network. Lines of green code cascaded down the black screen. My stomach dropped. Wyatt had not just changed the locks on my doors. He had weaponized my own internet connection. The diagnostic test revealed a heavy, aggressive packet-sniffing spyware program directly embedded into the main router downstairs. The spyware was programmed to intercept, copy, and analyze every single piece of data leaving the house. If I hit send on an email, the message would not just go to my lawyer. The spyware would instantly forward a copy of the email directly to Wyatt's phone, along with an alert that an unauthorized device was active on the network. Wyatt would walk up those stairs in less than 10 seconds and destroy the laptop. I was completely electronically isolated. The golden cage was sealed tight with an invisible digital electric fence. I slowly closed the silver laptop. I could not fight him using my own internet. I needed a phantom connection. I sat in the silent guest bedroom staring at the closed silver laptop. Wyatt thought he had boxed me into a corner. He believed his expensive packet-sniffing software on my router was an impenetrable wall. But Wyatt was a man who relied entirely on his checkbook to solve problems. I built my career relying on my intellect and my patience. I picked up the heavy laptop and quietly walked out of the bedroom. The thick brick walls of my Brooklyn brownstone blocked most external signals, but there was one weak point in the architecture. I moved down the hallway and slipped into the guest bathroom located on the east side of the house. This room shared a property line with my neighbor, a retired federal judge named Arthur. 3 years ago, Arthur complained to me about his internet security. He was paranoid about hackers accessing his sensitive legal archives. As a favor, I completely rebuilt his home network. While configuring his firewalls, I discreetly programmed a hidden secondary wireless access point. I designed it to broadcast a very faint signal completely invisible to standard device scans to serve as a failsafe in case my own secure servers ever went down. I sat on the cold hexagonal tiles of the bathroom floor, resting the laptop on the lid of the porcelain toilet. I opened the screen and brought up the advanced network configuration panel. The standard wireless menu showed nothing but Wyatt's heavily monitored network. I opened the command terminal and manually typed in the hidden service set identifier I had created. I typed the network name Arthur Ghost. The system prompted me for a security key. I carefully keyed in the 32-character alphanumeric password I had memorized 3 years ago. I hit enter and held my breath as the loading circle spun. The system processed the request. A small green icon appeared at the bottom of the screen. I was connected. I had a clean, untraceable, and completely unmonitored bridge to the outside world. Wyatt had locked the physical doors, but I had just picked the digital lock. I wasted no time celebrating. I opened a secure browser window and navigated directly to the New York State County Clerk's private commercial portal. Using my master identification credentials, I bypassed the public records search and accessed the pending corporate transaction queue tied to my social security number. The screen loaded a list of active legal filings. At the very top, marked with a bright red urgent tag, was a transfer of deed request. I clicked the file and began reading the digital paperwork. The sheer audacity of the document made my blood run cold. Wyatt had wasted no time weaponizing the fake medical conservatorship. The document listed me as the seller represented by my legal guardians, Wyatt and Kendra. The property being sold was my $30 million commercial lot in downtown Brooklyn. I scrolled down to the buyer information. The purchasing entity was a newly registered limited liability company called Apex Holdings. It took me exactly 2 minutes of cross-referencing state tax databases to pierce the corporate veil. Apex Holdings was a shell company wholly owned by Wyatt's primary real estate development firm. He was legally selling my land to himself, but the purchase price listed on the contract was the most insulting detail. Wyatt had authorized the sale for a mere $2 million. He was stealing $28 million of raw equity right out from under me to save his failing business. I checked the timestamps on the legal filings to understand his timeline. A transaction of this magnitude required a formal board approval from the purchasing firm to authorize the release of funds. I pulled up the public schedule for Wyatt's corporate board. There it was. An emergency shareholder meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning at their headquarters in Chicago. The pieces of their puzzle were perfectly aligned. This was the exact reason Kendra had canceled my flight. If I had boarded that plane to Chicago, I could have walked into that boardroom, proved my absolute mental competence, and legally blocked the transaction. By trapping me in my own home under a fabricated medical hold, Wyatt ensured the sale would execute automatically. I looked at the clock on the bottom corner of the laptop screen. It was shortly past noon. I had less than 20 hours to completely dismantle a corporate theft that Wyatt had spent months meticulously planning. I did not allow myself to feel anger. Anger clouds judgment and creates mistakes. I needed an immediate tactical countermeasure. I closed the county clerk portal and logged directly into the secure offshore server that managed my primary financial trusts. I navigated through 3 layers of encrypted security menus until I reached the extreme contingency protocols. Decades ago, after witnessing clients lose everything to hostile takeovers and corporate espionage, I instructed my developers to build a scorched earth defensive mechanism into my portfolio. It was labeled the Emergency Asset Freeze. Activating this protocol would instantly lock every bank account, property, deed, and trust fund associated with my identity. It would freeze all pending transactions worldwide for a mandatory period of 30 days. It would completely override Wyatt's fake conservatorship, requiring a federal judge to manually review the lock before a single penny could be moved. I moved the cursor over the red activation button. I clicked execute. A warning banner immediately flashed across the screen. The system initiated a dual-factor authentication check for an action this severe. A message popped up in bold white text. It stated that a highly encrypted 6-digit one-time password had just been sent via text message to my primary registered mobile device. I stared at the glowing screen as the reality of my situation crushed down on me. My primary registered mobile device was the exact smartphone Wyatt had meticulously stolen from my suit jacket last night. The system was currently displaying a 5-minute countdown timer. If I did not enter that 6-digit code, the freeze request would automatically cancel and the system would lock me out for 24 hours due to suspicious activity. I could not bypass this security measure. I could not hack my own bank. That smartphone was currently sitting inside the tailored pants pocket of my arrogant son-in-law, somewhere downstairs in the very same house. Wyatt had unknowingly carried the only key to his own destruction right into my living room. I slowly closed the laptop and placed it back on the bathroom floor. I had to physically retrieve that phone tonight. If I failed to get it, I would lose everything I had built over my entire life by tomorrow morning. The corporate war had suddenly become a physical one. I waited in the dark of my bedroom until the heavy grandfather clock in the downstairs foyer chimed 2 in the morning. The deep, resonant sound echoed through the empty corridors of my home. The house was finally dead silent. I stood up and carefully stretched my legs, preparing my 69-year-old joints for the physical toll of what I was about to do. I stepped out of my room and moved down the long corridor toward the master suite. Wyatt had transformed my home into a high-tech prison, installing biometric scanners even on the interior hallway doors leading to the master wing. He wanted to ensure I could never wander into their private space and discover whatever lies they were plotting. But Wyatt only understood the surface level of security technology. He relied on expensive contractors to build his walls. He did not understand the foundational wiring of a house built 50 years ago, a house I had painstakingly renovated with my own 2 hands. I crept to the utility closet at the end of the hall and opened the small wooden panel hiding the secondary electrical breaker. I knew exactly which copper wire fed power to the newly installed door frame on the master wing. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a metal fingernail clipper I had taken from my bathroom, and carefully severed the low-voltage red line. The biometric scanner instantly powered down, its glowing indicator ring fading to black. The magnetic lock disengaged with a soft, barely audible click. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the master suite. The central air conditioning hummed quietly, pushing cool air through the vents and masking the sound of my footsteps. I scanned the darkness. Wyatt was sprawled across the massive king-size bed, snoring loudly with his mouth open. His expensive tailored suit pants were draped carelessly over a velvet accent chair near the foot of the bed. My smartphone was still sitting inside his front pocket. I could see the rectangular outline of the device pressing tightly against the gray fabric. I took a slow, calculated step forward. Then I saw the blue light. The faint, flickering glow was spilling out from beneath the slightly open door of the attached walk-in closet. I froze instantly, my heart pounding a steady, disciplined rhythm against my ribs. Someone was awake inside. I adjusted my angle and peered through the narrow crack between the door and the frame. Kendra was sitting on the plush carpet of the closet floor, her knees pulled tightly up to her chest. Her face was bathed in the harsh artificial light of an oversized tablet resting on her lap. She was not sleeping. She was frantically tapping the screen with trembling, erratic fingers. I narrowed my eyes, focusing on the interface reflected in the large vanity mirror directly behind her. It was an offshore online casino, the kind of unregulated platform that caters to high-stakes addicts. The digital roulette wheel spun rapidly before flashing a massive red negative balance on the screen. Kendra let out a ragged, desperate whisper that cut through the silence of the room. She grabbed her own hair and pulled it tightly, her entire body shaking with raw panic. She muttered to herself that she just needed one more day. She whispered to the empty room that if Wyatt's land deal did not close by tomorrow morning, the syndicate would absolutely kill her. She repeated the words over and over like a morbid prayer. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying, undeniable clarity. Kendra was not simply a greedy daughter trying to secure an early inheritance or blindly supporting her ambitious husband. She was a desperate, drowning gambling addict. She owed millions of dollars to an underground criminal syndicate. She had orchestrated this entire medical kidnapping not just to help Wyatt's failing business, but because she desperately needed her cut of his fraudulent commission to save her own life. My own daughter had placed a price tag on my freedom and my sanity to pay off illegal bookies. The depth of her betrayal was sickening. A physical blow to my chest, but I could not afford the luxury of grief. Grief is a distraction, and I had a narrow window to act. While Kendra was completely consumed by the spinning digital wheel, I dropped to my hands and knees and crawled across the carpet toward the velvet chair. Wyatt shifted violently in his sleep, his heavy arm throwing the duvet off his chest. I stopped breathing. I stayed perfectly still against the floorboards for 10 agonizing seconds until his breathing returned to a deep, rhythmic snore. I reached up and carefully slid my fingers into the pocket of his pants. I gripped the smooth glass of my smartphone and slowly pulled it out. The screen instantly lit up, illuminating my face in the dark room. I immediately shoved the phone tight against my chest to smother the light, stood up, and silently backed out of the bedroom. I moved swiftly back down the dark hallway and locked myself inside the guest bathroom. I sat on the cold tile floor and opened the silver laptop. The 5-minute countdown timer on the bank portal was dangerously close to 0. I unlocked my stolen phone. The notification screen displayed the newly generated 6-digit alphanumeric code from my offshore trust. I quickly typed the characters into the secure browser and hit the execution key. The loading circle spun for 3 excruciating seconds that felt like an eternity. Then the screen turned a solid, brilliant green. A confirmation message appeared in bold white letters stating that the global emergency asset freeze was fully active. Every single bank account, property, deed, and trust fund bearing my name was instantly locked down under a federal hold. Wyatt's fraudulent real estate transaction was officially blocked. I powered down the laptop, hid it safely back in the dresser drawer, and returned to my bed. I placed my phone under my mattress, closed my eyes, and allowed myself a single deep breath of victory. But I knew the victory was entirely digital. The physical reality of my situation was about to become infinitely worse. I lay awake for the rest of the night, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling. I was awakened fully 4 hours later by a massive, violent crash. The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the curtains when my bedroom door was kicked completely off its hinges. The heavy wood slammed against the drywall, splintering the doorframe and sending dust into the air. Wyatt stood in the doorway, panting heavily like a cornered animal, his face flushed with pure, unadulterated rage. He was fully dressed in his sharp business suit, but his tie was undone and his hair was wildly unkempt. He held his own tablet in his shaking hand, the screen displaying the catastrophic failure of his $30 million land transfer. The legal loophole he thought he controlled had been completely shattered by my invisible hand. Wyatt threw his tablet against the wall, shattering the glass into 100 pieces. He stepped into my room, his fists clenched tight at his sides. His arrogant, polished corporate facade was completely gone, replaced by the desperate fury of a ruined man. The white-collar criminal had failed to steal my life with paperwork. Now he was going to use brutal physical force. Wyatt stood in the splintered doorway of my bedroom, his chest heaving as the reality of his blocked transactions settled in. I expected him to charge at me. I expected a physical altercation. But Wyatt was a coward who preferred others to do his dirty work. He stared at me with pure venom, slowly backed out of the room and pulled a second phone from his jacket pocket. He dialed 911. The moment the dispatcher answered, his entire demeanor shifted. The raging tyrant vanished, replaced instantly by the trembling voice of a terrified family member. He told the operator that his elderly father-in-law had suffered a complete psychotic break. He claimed I was destroying the house wielding a weapon and threatening to take my own life. It was a masterful, sickening performance. Within 10 minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of 3 police cruisers illuminated the frosted glass of my front windows. Heavy footsteps thundered up my grand staircase. 4 armed police officers stormed into my bedroom, their hands resting cautiously on their holsters. Right behind them were 2 emergency medical technicians carrying a heavy canvas straitjacket. Wyatt and Kendra stood in the hallway. Kendra was sobbing hysterically into her hands, playing the devastated daughter for the audience in uniform. Wyatt stepped forward and handed the lead officer a thick stack of medical files. He explained that I suffered from severe aggressive dementia and had refused my medication for weeks. He pointed to the splintered doorframe he had just kicked down and told the officers I had destroyed it in a fit of violent rage. The officer looked at me, assessing the threat. I stood perfectly still by the window. I did not raise my voice. I did not attempt to defend myself against the accusations. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how the law operated. If an elderly black man attempts to fiercely argue with armed police officers inside a chaotic scene, he is instantly perceived as hostile and delusional. Silence was my only armor. I slowly raised my hands and offered my wrists to the officers. The medical technicians stepped forward, grabbed my arms roughly, and forced me into the thick canvas straitjacket. They pulled the heavy leather straps tight across my chest, completely restricting my breathing and my movement. They dragged me out of my own home like a dangerous criminal while my daughter and her husband watched from the shadows of the hallway. The ambulance ride was a blur of blaring sirens and sharp turns. I was bolted to a metal gurney, staring up at the sterile white ceiling of the vehicle. When the rear doors finally swung open, I was not at a standard city hospital. We had arrived at Sunset Pines. On the surface, Sunset Pines was a sprawling, ultra-luxury psychiatric facility located on a secluded estate outside the city limits. It catered to wealthy families who needed to quietly dispose of their problematic relatives. In reality, it was an unregulated prison operated by doctors who cared more about their bank balances than the Hippocratic Oath. The orderlies unbuckled the gurney and wheeled me through a set of heavy, reinforced steel security doors. The scent of strong bleach and clinical apathy hung heavily in the air. They took me straight to the intake processing room in the maximum security wing. There I met Dr. Hayes. He was a tall, unnervingly calm man wearing a pristine white coat and an imported Swiss watch that cost more than most people earned in a decade. That watch told me everything I needed to know. Honest doctors working in psychiatric wards do not wear $50,000 timepieces. Dr. Hayes had clearly been heavily compensated by Wyatt to ensure I remained silenced. The orderlies forcefully removed the straitjacket. Before I could stretch my aching shoulders, they stripped me of my tailored suit, my silk tie, and my leather shoes. They handed me a set of thin, humiliatingly cheap gray hospital scrubs. Every ounce of my personal dignity was systematically stripped away in that cold room. Dr. Hayes stood behind a metal desk, casually reviewing Wyatt's fabricated medical file. He did not ask me a single diagnostic question. He did not test my cognitive abilities. He simply looked at me with dead, empty eyes and declared that I was a severe danger to myself and others. He formally initiated a mandatory 48-hour psychiatric hold. My mind raced, crunching the numbers and the timeline. 48 hours. That was the exact window Wyatt needed. By locking me in a padded cell with zero communication to the outside world, Wyatt had the clear runway to petition a state judge. He would claim I was violently insane and use my forced institutionalization to instantly override my emergency asset freeze. I was escorted down a long, windowless corridor by two massive guards. They opened the heavy steel door to cell number 4 and shoved me inside. The door slammed shut with a deafening metallic clang. The deadbolt engaged. I was in a 10-by-10 room with padded walls, a thin mattress on a concrete slab, and a stainless steel toilet. There were no windows. There were no clocks. There was a single security camera mounted in the corner, its red light blinking methodically, watching my every move. I was completely isolated from the world. I sat on the edge of the thin mattress, staring at the padded wall opposite me. The silence in the isolation cell was absolute and suffocating. Wyatt had successfully escalated his corporate theft into a brutal physical kidnapping. He had paid off the right people and utilized the system perfectly. But a forensic accountant knows that no system is truly impenetrable. Every secure network has a backdoor, and every corrupt institution has a weak link. I just had to wait for the variables to present themselves. Hours dragged by. The artificial lights in the ceiling suddenly flickered and dimmed, signaling the facility's mandated evening lockdown. A few minutes later, I heard the heavy, rhythmic footsteps of an orderly walking down the corridor. The footsteps stopped outside my door. The small metal viewing slot near the bottom of the steel door slid open with a harsh scrape. A gray plastic tray holding a bowl of tasteless soup, a piece of dry bread, and a small paper cup of water was shoved aggressively through the opening. The slot slammed shut. I stood up and walked over to the tray resting on the floor. I was not hungry, but I needed to maintain my physical strength for the battles ahead. I picked up the plastic bowl of soup. As I lifted the bowl, I noticed something resting underneath it. It was a cheap, rough paper napkin slightly folded at the corner. I picked it up and opened it. Written in smeared blue ink across the center of the napkin was a 10-digit phone number. Directly beneath the number was a single word: Gregory. It was the first name of my ruthless attorney. My chest tightened with a sudden, fierce surge of adrenaline. Someone inside this corrupt, impenetrable fortress was secretly working for me. I crumpled the napkin into a tiny ball and swallowed it with a sip of water to destroy the evidence. I had an ally. Now, I just needed to figure out how to get my hands on a telephone while being watched 24 hours a day. I spent the rest of the night calculating the logistics of my escape. When the harsh fluorescent lights buzzed back to life at 6 in the morning, the heavy steel door remained firmly shut. I stood by the reinforced glass window, silently observing the morning routine of the high-security ward. At exactly 7 o'clock, a rusted metal cleaning cart rattled down the hallway. Pushing the cart was a young Latino man wearing faded blue scrubs. His plastic name tag read Mateo. As he mopped the linoleum floor outside my cell, he briefly looked up. His dark eyes locked onto mine for a fraction of a second. He tapped his mop handle twice against the base of my door. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. Mateo was my inside man. He had a phone for me. But recognizing the ally was only the first step. The real problem was the obstacle sitting directly between us. A massive security nurse named Brody sat on a folding chair right outside my window. Brody was built like a retired heavyweight boxer with thick arms and a bored, cruel expression on his face. His sole job was to monitor me. He never took his eyes off the glass. Mateo slowly dragged his wet mop back and forth, trying to inch closer to my door, but Brody immediately barked at him to step back. There was absolutely no physical way for Mateo to hand me a contraband device through a solid steel door, while a trained guard was watching my every breath. I walked back to my thin mattress and sat down. I needed to force Brody to open that door. I needed to create a scenario so chaotic and urgent that Brody would abandon his post and completely break his line of sight. I needed a medical emergency. I could not simply pretend to faint. Brody would just call for a doctor and wait outside. I had to simulate a catastrophic, life-threatening event that required his immediate physical intervention. During my decades as a forensic accountant, I investigated multiple massive healthcare fraud syndicates. I spent hundreds of hours reading detailed medical textbooks to understand exactly how corrupt doctors documented neurological trauma. I knew the precise physiological markers of a grand mal seizure. I stood up in the center of the small room and began to hyperventilate. I took rapid, shallow breaths, forcing my blood pressure to spike and my heart rate to accelerate dangerously. When I felt lightheaded and dizzy, I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek. The sharp, metallic taste of warm blood filled my mouth. I stiffened every single muscle in my body, locked my knees, and allowed myself to fall backward. I hit the solid concrete floor with a sickening, brutal thud. The impact sent a shockwave of genuine pain radiating up my spine, but I ignored it completely. I began to thrash violently against the ground. I rolled my eyes back into my head until only the whites were visible. I let the mixture of saliva and blood spill out of the corner of my mouth. I slammed my elbows against the concrete, mimicking the uncontrollable muscle spasms of a man whose brain was misfiring. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard the heavy folding chair outside scrape violently against the linoleum. Brody shouted a string of curses. The heavy deadbolt clicked and the steel door swung wide open. Brody rushed into the cell, dropping to his knees beside me. He followed his emergency training perfectly, grabbing my shoulders to turn me onto my side to prevent me from choking on my own fluids. He was completely focused on my face. At that exact moment, the doorway was left completely unguarded. Mateo dropped his mop and rushed into the frame, playing the role of a panicked janitor trying to help. Brody screamed at him to stay back and call the medical team. Mateo took one step back, but his right hand darted out with lightning speed. He slid a small, black rectangular object across the concrete floor. The burner phone skidded perfectly under the steel frame of my bed and dropped directly into the empty metal bedpan hidden beneath it. Mateo instantly retreated down the hallway, shouting for help. I continued to thrash for another 10 seconds before slowly letting my muscles relax. I went limp, pretending to enter the postictal state of confusion that follows a major seizure. Brody checked my pulse, his hands shaking slightly. A team of nurses rushed into the room seconds later with a medical bag. They shined a bright pen light into my eyes and took my blood pressure. I played the part of the confused, exhausted elderly patient flawlessly. Satisfied that the immediate danger had passed, the medical team helped me onto the thin mattress. They told Brody to keep a closer eye on me and left the room. Brody walked out, slamming the heavy steel door shut and re-engaging the deadbolt. I waited until Brody sat back down in his chair and pulled out his own smartphone to text someone. I slowly rolled over on the mattress, hanging my arm over the edge. I reached into the cold metal bedpan and my fingers brushed against the cheap plastic casing of the burner phone. I pulled it under my blanket. The screen was cracked, but it had a full battery and a strong cellular signal. I navigated to the keypad and punched in the 10-digit number from the napkin I had swallowed the night before. I held the phone tight against my ear, burying my head under the thin pillow to muffle my voice. The line rang twice before a sharp, gravelly voice answered. It was Gregory Pierce. I quickly identified myself and told him I was locked inside Sunset Pines under a fabricated psychiatric hold. I expected Gregory to immediately deploy his associates to extract me. I expected him to confirm that my emergency asset freeze was holding strong. Instead, a heavy, ominous silence filled the line. When Gregory finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual arrogant confidence. He told me he had devastating news. Wyatt had outsmarted us. Wyatt realized the federal freeze prevented him from executing a standard commercial sale, so Wyatt utilized his political connections. He bypassed the banking system entirely by exploiting a corrupt state-level eminent domain loophole. Gregory explained that Wyatt had bribed a city zoning commissioner to declare my Brooklyn property a severe abandoned environmental hazard. Because I was legally documented as mentally incompetent and locked in an asylum, the state ruled I was incapable of maintaining the hazard. The city government had officially seized the land this morning. The state was going to auction the property to the highest bidder tomorrow afternoon to cover the fake environmental cleanup costs. And the only registered bidder for that auction was Wyatt's development firm. Gregory told me the transaction was entirely legal at the state level and completely bypassed my offshore banking freeze. Wyatt was going to buy my $30 million property from the city government for pennies, and there was absolutely nothing a civil court could do to stop it by tomorrow. The defensive shield I had built over 20 years was completely shattered. I lay under the scratchy hospital blanket listening to the static on the phone line. Civil defense had failed. Wyatt had used the government as his weapon. I told Gregory to stop filing injunctions. I told him we were no longer playing defense. If Wyatt wanted the land that badly, I was going to let him have it. I hung up the cheap burner phone and slid it back into the metal bedpan. I stared up at the blank ceiling of my cell. It was time to give my greedy son-in-law exactly what he wanted, wrapped in a financial poison that would destroy him forever. I held the cheap burner phone tightly against my ear, listening to the heavy breathing of my attorney on the other end of the line. Gregory Pierce was a man who practically breathed litigation. He was a shark in a tailored suit, and right now he was furious that a corrupt city zoning commissioner had outmaneuvered him. He started shouting into the receiver, promising to file emergency appeals with the state Supreme Court, threatening to drag the mayor into a federal corruption probe. I cut him off sharply. I told him to withdraw every single injunction. I ordered him to stand down and let the city auction proceed. I commanded him to let Wyatt win the bid for the Brooklyn property. A dead, chilling silence stretched across the cellular connection. When Gregory finally spoke, his voice was tight with genuine concern. He asked me if the medications they were forcing into my system had finally broken my mind. He reminded me that this piece of land was the cornerstone of my entire financial legacy. If Wyatt bought it through the city auction, he would own $30 million of prime real estate for practically nothing, and he would use that equity to save his failing development firm. Gregory pleaded with me not to surrender. He thought I was giving up because I was trapped in a padded cell. I lowered my voice to a sharp, commanding whisper. I reminded Gregory that I spent 40 years dismantling the offshore empires of billionaires and corporate frauds. I do not surrender. I adapt. I explained that fighting a rigged state government in civil court is a massive waste of time and capital. Wyatt had built a perfect legal wall to steal my property. So instead of trying to break down his wall, I was going to let him lock himself inside the fortress and then burn it to the ground. I told Gregory we were no longer playing defense. We were shifting to pure, unadulterated offense. I was going to use Wyatt's own towering arrogance and bottomless greed as the ultimate weapon against him. I ordered Gregory to listen very carefully and take notes. I told him to access my secure master physical file located in the hidden floor safe of his downtown office. Inside that vault was a red manila folder labeled Project Lazarus. Gregory muttered under his breath as he presumably walked toward his vault. I explained the true history of the Brooklyn property. When I purchased that massive commercial lot 20 years ago, I did not just buy the dirt. I bought the holding company that owned the dirt. And that specific holding company carried a massive toxic secret from the early 1980s. The previous owners had committed severe environmental dumping and engaged in aggressive corporate tax evasion. When I acquired the entity, I used my forensic accounting expertise to quarantine that liability. I buried the debt under 6 layers of international shell corporations and legally bound it to my specific offshore trust. As long as the property remained under my exact legal name and my trust, the liability remained completely dormant. The government could not touch it. But the quarantine was highly fragile. I designed it as a scorched earth contingency plan, a financial poison pill. I explained to Gregory that if the property deed was ever forcibly transferred to a new commercial entity, the protective shell would instantly shatter. The moment Wyatt's development firm took legal ownership of that land through the state auction, the dormancy clause would evaporate. The Internal Revenue Service and the Environmental Protection Agency would be immediately and automatically notified of the structural change. They would instantly audit the new owner, and they would retroactively apply 40 years of compounding interest and environmental penalties directly to Wyatt's holding company. I heard Gregory gasp sharply over the phone line. He realized the magnitude of the trap. Wyatt thought he was buying a $30 million asset. In reality, he was voluntarily legally absorbing a $15 million federal tax lien. Because Wyatt's firm was already bleeding cash and desperately leveraged, a sudden $15 million federal debt would be an instant death sentence. It would trigger immediate bankruptcy, freeze all of his investor capital, and bring federal agents crashing through the doors of his corporate headquarters. Wyatt was not stealing my legacy. He was signing his own corporate execution order. Gregory let out a low, dark laugh that echoed through the phone. He called me a ruthless genius. But then his legal mind caught up to the logistical reality of the situation, and the amusement instantly vanished from his voice. He identified the fatal flaw in my brilliant plan. The poison pill was not entirely automatic under an eminent domain seizure. Because the city was acting as an intermediary in the auction, the liability transfer required a specific chain of custody document to satisfy the federal tax code. To legally attach that massive debt directly to Wyatt's firm, the Internal Revenue Service required a physical disclosure form. That form needed to be signed by the previous owner, officially acknowledging the transfer of the encumbered asset to the new buyer. It needed my signature. And therein lay the ultimate paradox. Wyatt had successfully petitioned a state judge to declare me mentally incompetent. He had locked me inside a high-security psychiatric ward with a fabricated diagnosis of severe dementia. Under the law, I was a ghost. Any document I signed right now was completely legally void. If I signed the federal disclosure form, Wyatt's lawyers would easily argue that I lacked the mental capacity to execute the document, and the $15 million trap would completely fall apart. The debt would revert back to my estate, and Wyatt would walk away with the clean property. I told Gregory I already knew the legal hurdle. The only way to validate my signature was to force Wyatt to validate my sanity. I could not just mail the document. I needed Wyatt to voluntarily walk into my isolation cell, hand me the pen, and formally accept the signed document in front of official licensed witnesses. I had to convince the man who imprisoned me to personally facilitate his own destruction. I told Gregory to draft the specific Internal Revenue Service transfer documents and have them ready by tomorrow morning. I promised him I would handle Wyatt. I hung up the burner phone, slid it back into the metal bedpan, and closed my eyes. The trap was perfectly constructed. Now I just needed the rat to take the bait. The morning sun did not reach the windowless isolation cell, but I knew it was dawn when the heavy breakfast cart rattled past my door in the hallway. I stood by the reinforced glass viewing window and knocked weakly against the pane. When Brody, the massive security nurse, finally looked over from his chair, I did not stand tall. I slumped my shoulders forward. I let my jaw go slack. I told him in a broken, raspy voice that I needed to see Dr. Hayes immediately. I told him I was ready to stop fighting. Within an hour, Dr. Hayes stood in my doorway, flanked by 2 large orderlies holding restraints. I put on the greatest psychological performance of my entire life. I forced genuine tears to pool in my eyes. I let my voice tremble with manufactured terror and deep exhaustion. I told the corrupt doctor that the isolation was too much, the medications were too strong, and the room was entirely too cold. I pleaded with him to call my son-in-law. I said I would give Wyatt absolutely whatever he wanted if he would just take me out of this concrete box and let me sleep in my own bed. Hayes smiled, a sickening expression of greedy satisfaction stretching across his face, and pulled out his smartphone. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy steel door swung open again. Wyatt walked in. He wore a sharp, custom-tailored navy blue suit, his hair perfectly styled, smelling of expensive cologne and unearned confidence. He looked around the padded cell with absolute disgust before his eyes settled on me. I was sitting on the edge of the thin mattress, wearing the cheap gray hospital scrubs, shivering intentionally. It took every single ounce of discipline I possessed to look at this man and cower. I am a man who built a financial empire from absolutely nothing. I am a black man who fought through decades of ruthless corporate prejudice to command rooms filled with billionaires and industry titans. Now, I had to physically shrink myself before a mediocre, arrogant thief who had never built a single thing on his own. I looked up at Wyatt and pleaded with him. I told him I knew about the city auction. I told him I knew he was buying the Brooklyn property through the eminent domain seizure today. I offered him the ultimate prize. I told him that an auction deed is messy and open to future litigation, but if he brought me the Federal Internal Revenue Service disclosure forms, I would voluntarily sign over the full uncontested property rights. I would make his ownership legally bulletproof, severing my trust from the land entirely. All I asked in return was my freedom. Wyatt did not come alone. He stepped aside, allowing a short, nervous-looking man clutching a worn leather briefcase to enter the cell. It was his personal corporate notary, a man clearly on the payroll, paid handsomely to look the other way when legal ethics were blatantly breached. Wyatt was absolutely glowing with triumph. He paced the small 10-by-10 room, treating my miserable prison like his own personal corporate boardroom. He did not immediately hand me the papers. He wanted to savor the kill. He wanted to gloat. He looked down at me and laughed, a cruel echoing sound that bounced off the padded walls and chilled the room. He mocked my entire career. He told me that my generation was entirely obsolete, that I had spent 40 years playing by the rules like a coward only to lose my greatest financial asset in a single weekend to someone much smarter. He boasted about how he was going to bulldoze the historic brick buildings currently sitting on the edge of my lot. He described the massive soulless glass and steel commercial skyscraper he was going to build in its place. He promised me he would put his own last name in massive gold letters at the very top of the tower, completely erasing my legacy from the city of New York forever. He even mentioned my daughter Kendra, claiming she was thrilled to finally be rid of my controlling grip over her inheritance. I swallowed the thick bile rising in my throat. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stand up to strike him, to intellectually tear him apart piece by piece until he realized the catastrophic mistake he was making. But a forensic accountant knows that you never ever interrupt an enemy when he is eagerly signing his own death warrant. I endured the brutal verbal humiliation. I nodded slowly. I agreed with his vile insults. I told him he was vastly smarter than me. I stroked his fragile ego to dangerous stratospheric heights. I made him feel like an invincible corporate titan who had just conquered the world. Wyatt soaked up my fabricated defeat like a sponge. He truly believed he had completely broken the great Harlan. Satisfied with his psychological torture, Wyatt snapped his fingers loudly. The nervous notary scurried forward and placed a thick stack of legal documents on the small stainless steel table bolted to the wall. At the very top of the stack was the exact Internal Revenue Service asset transfer disclosure form that Gregory had warned me about. Wyatt pulled a heavy gold-plated fountain pen from his breast pocket and tossed it carelessly onto the table. It clattered loudly against the metal. He ordered me to sign my life away. I slowly stood up from the mattress and shuffled painfully toward the metal table. I reached out and picked up the heavy gold pen, but instead of grabbing it with my right hand, I deliberately took it with my left. I am strictly right-handed. Wyatt immediately noticed the awkward, clumsy grip. His eyes narrowed with a sudden flash of suspicion. He harshly asked me what I was doing. I kept my head down, my hand shaking violently on purpose. I whispered that the massive seizure I suffered yesterday morning had severely damaged the nerve endings in my right arm. I told him I had absolutely no feeling in my dominant fingers. The arrogant son-in-law scoffed completely, buying the medical lie, and impatiently tapped his expensive leather shoe on the concrete floor. He told me to stop complaining and just get it done. I pressed the gold nib against the thick federal paper. I carefully signed my full legal name, but I executed the trap perfectly. For 20 years, my private bankers, my legal team, and the federal tax authorities have maintained a strict biometric signature profile on my master accounts. We established a silent distress code specifically for hostage situations or extreme corporate coercion. When I write the letter N at the end of my first name and the loop on the H in my last name, I intentionally break the lower curves, leaving sharp, disconnected angles instead of smooth loops. It is entirely imperceptible to the untrained eye, but to a federal auditor or an automated banking security scanner, It instantly flags the document as signed under extreme duress. This action legally transfers the asset to trigger the hidden tax liability while simultaneously opening a massive federal fraud investigation into the buyer. I finished the broken signature. Wyatt snatched the paper off the table before the ink was even dry. He inspected it, saw my name firmly on the dotted line, and grinned like a predator. He signaled the notary, who quickly stamped the page with his official state seal. The trap was perfectly set. Wyatt had just swallowed the $15 million poison pill. I looked at him with wide, hopeful eyes. I asked him if he would tell the doctor to release me so we could go home now. Wyatt stopped at the heavy cell door. He turned back to look at me, his triumphant smile transforming into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. He told me I was not going anywhere. He said the medical hold was indefinite, and he was leaving me in this concrete box to rot for the rest of my miserable life. He stepped out of the room. The heavy steel door slammed shut. The deadbolt engaged with a final echoing thud. I was left entirely alone in the silence of the cell. But as Wyatt's confident footsteps faded down the hallway, I did not feel an ounce of despair. I stood up straight, the manufactured weakness instantly melting from my posture. I smiled in the dark. The ultimate checkmate was officially in motion. The passage of 24 hours inside a windowless isolation cell heavily distorts your perception of reality. I sat on the thin, uncomfortable mattress waiting patiently for the inevitable confirmation that Wyatt had finalized his own corporate suicide. That confirmation arrived exactly at 3 o'clock the following afternoon. The heavy steel door to my cell did not simply open. It was practically thrown wide by the security nurse Brody, who stepped aside with a surprising amount of deference and respect. My daughter Kendra walked into the 10 by 10 concrete box. She looked absolutely radiant. She wore a brand new, sharply tailored white designer blazer and carried a heavy leather handbag that easily cost $5,000. The stench of her expensive floral perfume aggressively overpowered the clinical, sterile smell of bleach that constantly hung in the air of the cell. She was clearly coming straight from Wyatt's downtown victory celebration. The state auction had officially closed. Wyatt's development firm now legally possessed the deed to my Brooklyn property. Kendra walked over to the small stainless steel table bolted to the wall and set down a cheap, thin plastic container of bruised green grapes she must have grabbed from a hospital cafeteria vending machine. It was a pathetic, insulting gesture of care from a woman who had just stolen a $30 million fortune. She turned to me and plastered a look of manufactured pity across her face. She spoke in a soft, sickeningly sweet tone, telling me she was so incredibly sorry things had to happen this way. She claimed she and Wyatt were completely exhausted from dealing with the intense legal paperwork all morning, but she assured me the stressful transfer was finally complete. She reached out and briefly patted my shoulder, promising me that this nightmare was almost over for both of us. She spun a beautiful, elaborate lie about how they were going to use a small fraction of the property funds to move me out of this maximum security psychiatric ward. She promised to find me a much nicer private assisted living facility in the suburbs, a place with a private garden and a large window by the end of the month. She desperately wanted me to believe she was my savior, a loving daughter stepping in to manage a tragic medical decline. I looked down at the pathetic container of bruised grapes and then back up at her perfectly manicured hands. I did not offer her the tears, the anger, or the gratitude she so desperately craved. Instead, I dropped the facade of the confused, broken old man entirely. I sat up perfectly straight, squared my shoulders, and locked my eyes directly onto hers. My voice was no longer raspy or weak. It was the sharp, commanding, and relentless tone of a forensic accountant preparing to completely dismantle a hostile witness on the stand. I asked her point blank if the offshore digital roulette wheels were still spinning against her favor. Kendra froze instantly. The fake, sympathetic smile completely vanished from her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained entirely from her cheeks, leaving her designer makeup looking harsh and unnatural. She took a slow, trembling step back, her expensive handbag slipping slightly from her shoulder. I did not give her a single second to recover her composure. I told her I saw the glowing screen of her tablet in the master closet 2 nights ago. I described the massive negative balance flashing in red on her screen. I told her I knew exactly why she had really canceled my flight to Chicago. It had absolutely nothing to do with Wyatt's failing real estate firm. Wyatt was just the arrogant, blunt instrument she used to authorize the theft. I told her I knew she was drowning in millions of dollars of debt to a violent underground gambling syndicate, and that those dangerous men had given her a lethal, unforgiving deadline. The absolute precision of my knowledge shattered her polished exterior into 1,000 pieces. Kendra's initial shock rapidly morphed into a vicious defensive rage. Her hands curled into tight fists. She stepped forward, her face twisting into a mask of pure, desperate ugliness. She abandoned the devoted daughter act completely. She screamed that I had absolutely no idea what kind of physical danger she was in. She yelled that I had millions of dollars locked away in untouchable trusts and offshore accounts while she was facing literal death threats from ruthless loan sharks who threatened to break her legs. She paced the small concrete cell, frantically and loudly justifying her horrific crimes. In her blind, self-righteous fury, she began to openly confess to every single detail of the criminal conspiracy. She admitted to personally bribing Dr. Hayes $30,000 in cash to fabricate the aggressive dementia diagnosis. She admitted to coordinating with the corrupt city zoning commissioner to force the state eminent domain auction. She screamed that she had to lock me in this padded cell and steal my property because my stubborn refusal to sell the land naturally was going to get her killed. She stood over me, her chest heaving heavily, and declared that I owed her my fortune simply because she was my child and I was supposed to protect her. She stood there panting, completely exposed, having laid out the entire criminal conspiracy in crystal clear detail without a single ounce of remorse. I simply nodded, my expression completely blank and devoid of any paternal warmth. I told her to enjoy her new designer blazer and to get out of my room immediately. Disgusted by my total lack of emotional reaction and my cold dismissal, Kendra grabbed her heavy bag, turned aggressively on her heel, and stormed out of the cell. She loudly ordered Brody to lock the door permanently and to ignore any requests I made. The heavy deadbolt slammed shut, sealing me back in the absolute silence of the isolation ward. I waited exactly 2 full minutes to ensure Brody had returned to his chair down the hall and settled into his phone. Then I calmly reached down to my feet. When Mateo the janitor had slipped me the burner phone yesterday morning, he had also performed another brilliantly subtle task. While pretending to aggressively clean a spilled drink near the foot of my bed, he had seamlessly swapped my standard-issue gray hospital slippers for an identical pair he had personally modified and smuggled in from the outside. I pulled the right slipper off my foot and pressed my thumbs firmly against the thick rubber heel. A small, precisely cut hidden compartment popped open. Nestled securely inside the hollow cavity was a high-definition voice-activated micro-digital audio recorder. I pulled the tiny black device out and pressed the stop button on its side. The red recording light blinked twice and faded to black. I had captured every single word of Kendra's furious, screaming confession in pristine, undeniable audio quality. I had her explicit verbal admission to medical kidnapping, federal wire fraud conspiracy, elder abuse, and bribing licensed medical officials. Later that evening, the heavy metal cart rattled down the hallway again to collect the empty dinner trays from the maximum security wing. Mateo pushed his yellow mop bucket closely behind it. As he passed my cell door, he tapped the metal doorframe twice with his wooden handle. I quickly slid the tiny micro-recorder through the narrow gap beneath the heavy steel door. Mateo seamlessly swept his wet mop over the exact spot, scooping the tiny device into his gloved hand without breaking his stride or alerting the guard. He was heading straight for the service exit to hand that recording directly to Gregory Pierce. The financial trap I set for Wyatt was already counting down to his total corporate destruction. Now the criminal trap was perfectly set for Kendra. I had the undeniable concrete proof required to send my own flesh and blood to a federal penitentiary. Gregory Pierce did not become the most feared corporate attorney in New York City by playing nice or waiting patiently in line. When Mateo, the brave janitor from the psychiatric ward, handed him the tiny black audio recorder in a dark alley behind Sunset Pines, Gregory did not waste a single second filing a standard civil injunction. Civil courts are painfully slow and deeply bureaucratic. They give financial rats the precious time they need to chew through the legal traps and hide the stolen cheese. Gregory took the audio recording and the freshly stamped Internal Revenue Service disclosure document directly to the J. Edgar Hoover Federal Building in Lower Manhattan. He bypassed the local police precincts completely and walked straight into the secure office of Special Agent Miller, a senior investigator in the white-collar financial crimes division. Gregory placed the tiny micro-recorder on the cold metal desk and pressed the play button. Kendra's shrill, screaming voice filled the quiet, sterile room. She aggressively laid out every single terrifying detail of the criminal conspiracy. The federal agent heard her confess to the $30,000 cash bribe paid to Dr. Hayes. He heard her admit to fabricating the aggressive dementia diagnosis. He heard the desperate, frantic blackmail surrounding the illegal guardianship and her massive debt to an underground gambling syndicate. Then Gregory laid the physical tax document right next to the recorder. He pointed a sharp finger at the jagged, broken loops in my signature. He explained the strict biometric distress code I had established with my international bankers 2 decades ago. He showed the federal agent exactly how Wyatt had knowingly coerced a man they claimed was legally incompetent into signing a binding federal tax document to facilitate a massive real estate theft. Agent Miller listened to the audio tape a second time in complete silence. He stared at the jagged signature that served as my silent cry for help. He realized instantly that this was not a simple domestic dispute over an elderly man's inheritance. This was a highly orchestrated multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy involving corrupt city zoning officials, bribed medical professionals, and dangerous organized crime syndicates. The federal government does not care about family drama, but they care deeply about systemic financial fraud. Gregory had successfully weaponized the FBI for my defense. While Gregory was sitting in the federal building arming the government with undeniable proof, Wyatt was celebrating his false victory in his penthouse corner office. He held the newly stamped property deed in his hands, completely unaware that the document was heavily laced with a lethal $15 million federal tax lien. Wyatt was a man driven entirely by immediate greed and rapidly mounting desperation. He could not wait months to properly develop the land. His commercial real estate firm was already drowning in severe operational debt, and Kendra's violent loan sharks were practically banging on his front door demanding their millions. He needed liquid cash immediately. So within hours of acquiring the deed through the corrupt city auction, Wyatt executed a massive high-interest commercial bridge loan. He used my $30 million Brooklyn property as absolute collateral to borrow $20 million in clean liquid cash from a predatory private equity firm. His plan was brutally simple and completely illegal. He was going to take the loan money wire a small fraction to the underground syndicate to keep Kendra alive and immediately transfer the rest into an untraceable offshore shell account in the Cayman Islands. He wanted to completely hide the cash before any civil court judges could review my fake medical hold or challenge the property transfer. Wyatt sat behind his expansive mahogany desk, his fingers flying arrogantly across his expensive mechanical keyboard. He logged into his primary corporate banking portal. He smiled as he saw the $20 million loan deposit sitting beautifully in his main checking account. He confidently navigated to the international wire transfer menu. He meticulously typed in the offshore routing numbers and the massive dollar amount. At that exact same moment across the city, Special Agent Miller was aggressively typing on his own secure government terminal. Gregory Pierce had convinced the federal prosecutor to bypass the slow local family courts entirely. By framing Wyatt's digital real estate maneuver and his imminent international money transfer as federal wire fraud, the FBI gained immediate unilateral jurisdiction. Wire fraud is a severe federal felony that carries devastating prison sentences. More importantly, it grants the government the absolute authority to freeze all associated assets instantly without a prior court hearing. Wyatt thought he was moving much faster than the law, but he was merely sprinting directly into a federal net that Gregory and I had woven together. Wyatt took a deep breath, raised his index finger, and confidently clicked the execute button on his banking portal. He expected to see the familiar green checkmark confirming the international wire transfer. He expected to feel the profound, arrogant relief of a man who had successfully stolen a fortune and gotten away with it completely. Instead, the loading circle on his high-resolution monitor spun rapidly for 5 agonizing seconds. Then the screen froze completely. The entire web page blinked heavily and reloaded with a violent stutter. The calming green interface of his corporate bank instantly turned a stark warning red. A bold, capitalized error message flashed across the center of his screen reading, "Transaction denied." Wyatt frowned in annoyance, assuming it was a simple server timeout or a minor network error. He aggressively mashed the refresh key on his keyboard. The page reloaded again, but this time the numbers at the top of the financial dashboard shifted entirely. Wyatt stared at the screen, his vision tunneling as a cold, paralyzing dread completely washed over his entire body. His primary corporate checking account, which just seconds ago held $20 million in stolen loan funds, now displayed a balance of exactly $0.00. He frantically clicked through his other accounts. His business operating account read 0. His personal savings account read 0. Even his emergency payroll reserves were entirely wiped out. Beneath the empty, terrifying balances was a single line of unyielding red text. Account locked pending federal investigation by the United States Department of Justice. The FBI had intercepted the wire transfer mere milliseconds before the funds left the country. They had dropped a massive, impenetrable federal freeze on his entire financial existence. Wyatt could not pay his payroll. He could not pay his defense lawyers. And most importantly, he could not pay the violent underground syndicate that was currently hunting his wife. He gripped the heavy edge of his mahogany desk so hard his knuckles turned completely white. The air in his luxury office suddenly felt impossibly thin and hard to breathe. The trap had violently snapped shut around his neck, and for the first time in his arrogant life, Wyatt realized he was completely outmatched. While Wyatt stared at the catastrophic zero balance on his computer screen in his downtown corner office, my daughter Kendra was experiencing her own terrifying descent into reality on the other side of the city. Kendra had spent the entire morning shopping at luxury boutiques, swiping credit cards she expected to be paid off by nightfall. She was desperately trying to maintain the flawless illusion of her high society lifestyle. But the criminal underworld does not respect the illusions of the wealthy. They only respect cold, hard cash. As she sat at a corner table in an exclusive cafe, the burner phone she kept hidden deep inside her designer handbag began to vibrate relentlessly. She pulled the cheap plastic device out and looked at the screen. She had received a live video feed from an anonymous encrypted number. Her breath caught in her throat as the video began to play. The footage showed a massive, heavily tattooed man sitting casually on the expensive white sofa inside her own locked living room. He was holding a loaded firearm, casually pointing the barrel at the family photographs resting on her mantle. The video ended abruptly, instantly followed by a single, terrifying text message. The message stated that her extended grace period was officially over. The syndicate required $3 million transferred into their untraceable offshore cryptocurrency wallet within exactly 24 hours. If the digital funds did not arrive by that exact deadline, they would not bother calling or sending another warning. They would simply send their men to collect the debt in blood. Pure suffocating terror gripped Kendra's chest. She knocked over her expensive coffee, grabbed her bags, and sprinted out of the cafe to her luxury sports car. She drove recklessly through the heavy city traffic, running red lights and ignoring the angry horns of other drivers. She was driven by the absolute primal instinct of survival. She needed her share of the real estate payout right this very second. Kendra abandoned her car in the loading zone of Wyatt's corporate headquarters and rushed past the security desk. She ignored the panicked protests of the executive assistants and burst violently through the heavy double doors of Wyatt's private corner office. She expected to find her husband celebrating their massive financial victory with a glass of expensive scotch. Instead, she found him frozen behind his mahogany desk, his face drained of all color, staring blankly at his computer monitor. Kendra locked the heavy oak door behind her and marched directly up to his desk. She slammed her hands down on the polished wood and demanded the international transfer codes. She screamed that she needed the confirmation routing numbers immediately so she could satisfy the syndicate. Wyatt did not answer her. He did not even blink. He slowly reached out and rotated his large, high-resolution computer monitor so it faced her directly. Kendra leaned forward. The bright red warning banner of the United States Department of Justice glared back at her. She stared at the bold letters declaring a massive federal wire fraud investigation. She looked down at the primary account balance. The bold zeros confirmed her absolute doom. She could not process the catastrophic reality in front of her. She demanded to know where the $20 million from the private bridge loan went. Wyatt finally spoke, his voice completely hollow and devoid of his usual arrogance. He told her the federal government had intercepted the money and seized every single penny of his corporate and personal wealth. The realization hit my daughter like a physical blow to the stomach. The violent underground syndicate does not care about federal investigations. They do not accept Department of Justice freezes as a valid excuse for missing a payment. If she told those ruthless men that the FBI took their money, they would torture her to death simply to set a bloody example for their other debtors. The carefully constructed, glamorous illusion of their wealthy marriage violently detonated inside that office. Kendra lunged across the desk like a wild animal, her perfectly manicured nails scratching deeply into Wyatt's cheek. She screamed that he was a pathetic, incompetent failure. She trusted him to manage the legal loopholes of stealing my property, and instead he had led federal agents directly to their front door. Wyatt reacted with explosive violence. He shoved her backward with such force that she stumbled and crashed heavily into a luxury leather sofa. He erupted with years of deeply repressed, toxic rage. He screamed that she was a degenerate parasite who had dragged him into this nightmare. He admitted his real estate firm was struggling, but it was her massive, unforgivable gambling debts that forced him to cross the line into kidnapping and corporate theft. He told her she was a toxic liability, and he deeply wished he had never met her. Kendra let out a manic, hysterical laugh that echoed off the glass walls of the office. She wiped a smudge of expensive makeup from her face and told him that his regrets were completely irrelevant now. She reminded him with brutal clarity how the criminal underworld operates. The loan sharks consider a husband equally responsible for the debts of his wife. When the syndicate realizes the $3 million is gone, they will not just kill her. They will hunt Wyatt down, drag him out of his luxury penthouse, and butcher him in the street. That specific threat cut entirely through Wyatt's shock and federal panic. The abstract idea of serving time in a white-collar federal prison was terrifying, but the immediate promise of brutal physical mob violence activated his deepest cowardice. He realized in an instant that he could not possibly fight the United States government and an armed criminal syndicate at the exact same time. He stopped screaming. His eyes went completely cold and dead as he made the ultimate selfish calculation. He realized his marriage was no longer a partnership of convenience, it was a literal death sentence. He turned his back on Kendra while she continued to hyperventilate on the leather sofa. He walked over to the rich wood paneling on the far side of his expansive office. He reached under a specific piece of decorative molding and pressed a hidden biometric scanner. A heavy section of the wall slid open silently to reveal a massive, reinforced steel safe. He placed his thumb on the lock and swung the heavy metal door open. Inside the vault was the emergency contingency bag every corrupt corporate executive secretly builds for the day the law finally catches up. It was a heavy black canvas duffel bag packed tightly with $500,000 in untraceable Swiss francs, a collection of encrypted burner phones, and a perfectly forged Canadian passport. Wyatt pulled the heavy strap over his shoulder and checked the contents. Kendra watched him, her furious anger instantly dissolving into pure groveling desperation. She dropped to her knees on the expensive imported rug. She wept openly, begging him to take her with him. She promised she would do absolutely anything he asked if he just helped her escape the country and hide from the men who wanted to kill her. Wyatt looked down at the woman he married with absolute, unfiltered disgust. He adjusted the heavy bag on his shoulder. He told her she was the heavy anchor that had dragged his entire empire to the bottom of the ocean, and he absolutely refused to let her drown him too. He stepped around her kneeling form, walked out of his office, and left my daughter completely alone to face the brutal consequences of the very crimes she forced him to commit. He was heading for a private airstrip to fly to a country with no extradition treaty. But Wyatt's arrogant assumption that he could simply fly away from his problems was a fatal miscalculation. He thought he was escaping the trap. He did not know that my lawyer and the federal authorities were already waiting for him at his final destination. The silence of the isolation cell was broken by the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots marching down the corridor. I sat calmly on the edge of the thin mattress, staring at the heavy steel door. I knew Gregory Pierce did not waste time. When my ruthless attorney filed a federal wire fraud complaint backed by an explicit audio confession, the government did not politely knock on the front door. The red security light above my cell began to flash violently. The blaring sound of the facility alarm echoed through the thick concrete walls. Outside my room, the massive security nurse Brody shouted something unintelligible before a loud, authoritative voice ordered him face down on the cold linoleum. I heard the sharp, metallic sound of a heavy battering ram striking the reinforced lock. On the second brutal strike, the deadbolt shattered completely into pieces. The heavy door swung inward with a massive crash hitting the padded wall. 4 federal agents wearing dark tactical gear and heavy body armor swarmed into the small room, their weapons lowered but ready. Right behind them, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal pinstripe suit, was Gregory. He did not look at the armed agents securing the perimeter. He walked straight toward me and offered a sharp, deeply satisfied smile. He told me it was time to check out of this terrible hotel. I took his extended hand and stood up. I walked out of the isolation cell for the last time. The maximum security wing of Sunset Pines had been completely transformed into a chaotic federal crime scene. Doctors and nurses who had confidently ignored my basic human rights yesterday were now lined up against the hallway walls in heavy steel handcuffs. Federal investigators were systematically confiscating computer servers, tearing through file cabinets, and boxing up decades of corrupt medical records. Wyatt thought he had buried me in an impenetrable fortress. He had actually locked me inside a massive criminal enterprise right before handing the FBI the exact map to destroy it. We reached the main lobby of the psychiatric facility. Dr. Hayes, the impeccably dressed head physician who had cheerfully condemned me to a padded cell for a $30,000 cash bribe, was kneeling on the expensive rug. His hands were bound tightly behind his back. His imported Swiss watch glinted under the harsh lobby lights, a pathetic reminder of the boundless greed that had just ruined his entire life. He looked up at me as I walked past. His face was pale and slick with sweat, stripped entirely of the arrogant medical authority he wielded yesterday. I did not stop to gloat or offer a single word. Gregory led me into a private administrative office the FBI had temporarily commandeered for their field operations. Resting gracefully on the wooden desk was my heavy leather suitcase. Gregory had dispatched a team to my house to retrieve my belongings while the FBI secured the hospital perimeter. I stepped into an adjoining private restroom and stripped off the humiliating, scratchy gray hospital scrubs. I washed the heavy stench of chemical bleach and confinement from my face. I dressed slowly, deliberately, putting on my custom-tailored navy wool suit, securing my silk tie, and sliding my feet into my polished leather Oxfords. With every single piece of high-quality clothing I put back on, I reclaimed a massive piece of the personal dignity Wyatt had tried to steal from me. When I stepped back into the office, I was no longer a helpless, confused patient. I was Harlan, the forensic accountant, who had just orchestrated a massive federal raid from inside a locked concrete box. A tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark windbreaker with the federal seal introduced himself as Special Agent Miller. He shook my hand firmly, offering a rare look of profound professional respect. Miller briefed me on the rapidly developing tactical situation. He confirmed the wire transfer block was completely successful. Every single penny of Wyatt's corporate wealth was locked down. Furthermore, the federal warrants had officially triggered the tax poison pill I attached to the Brooklyn property deed. Wyatt's firm was actively being crushed under $15 million of instant federal debt. Miller pulled out a tablet showing a live satellite tracking map. He explained that Wyatt had completely panicked and abandoned Kendra in his office. The FBI had successfully traced his encrypted burner phone. Miller confidently stated that Wyatt was driving north toward Teterboro Airport. He had a chartered private jet waiting on the tarmac to fly to a non-extradition jurisdiction in South America. Miller assured me tactical teams were already positioned at the airstrip, ready to swarm Wyatt's vehicle the absolute second he breached the perimeter gates. Wyatt was going to be arrested quietly, safely, and swiftly. I looked at the glowing blue dot moving rapidly across the digital map on the tablet. I shook my head slowly and told Special Agent Miller to call off the airport interception immediately. Miller frowned, visibly confused by the bold and highly unusual request. He warned me that if Wyatt successfully boarded that private plane, he would be completely out of federal jurisdiction forever. I looked Miller directly in the eye and explained the fundamental psychology of a desperate, cornered, white-collar criminal. Wyatt was indeed running, but he was not going straight to the airport. The black canvas bag he kept hidden in his office vault only held enough emergency cash to bribe a pilot and secure a fake passport. To survive permanently on the run in a foreign country, Wyatt needed millions in untraceable liquid capital. And as a forensic accountant who had spent months secretly investigating my own son-in-law, I knew exactly where he kept his shadow funds. Tonight was supposed to be the most triumphant evening of his professional life. His real estate firm was hosting a lavish corporate gala at a luxury downtown hotel to officially announce the fraudulent acquisition of my Brooklyn property to his international investors. Wyatt kept a massive reserve of bearer bonds and raw diamonds in a heavily fortified biometric vault hidden in the basement management offices of that exact hotel. He was not driving to Teterboro yet. He was driving directly into his own gala to empty that vault before fleeing the country forever. Gregory Pierce smiled widely, instantly recognizing the brilliant, devastating reality of my deduction. Miller remained highly hesitant, arguing that a public takedown at a crowded high society event was an unpredictable and dangerous operational risk. I leaned over the wooden desk and firmly laid out my absolute terms. I had spent 2 agonizing days locked inside a padded cell stripped of my humanity while Wyatt paraded around the city pretending to be an untouchable master of the universe. I refused to let him be arrested in the quiet, protective shadows of an empty runway. I wanted the elite members of his high society circle to see exactly who he truly was. I demanded that the FBI allow Wyatt to walk into that extravagant ballroom. I demanded that they let him stand in front of his wealthy peers and deliver his arrogant victory speech. And most importantly, I demanded that the federal agents hold their tactical positions until I personally walked through the main doors of that gala. Wyatt had used a public audience to humiliate me and steal my legacy. Now I was going to use his own audience to completely obliterate his empire. Miller looked at Gregory, who nodded in absolute agreement with my strategy. The federal agent picked up his radio and immediately ordered the airport tactical teams to reroute heavily to the downtown luxury hotel. I straightened my silk tie and picked up my heavy leather briefcase. The silent adjustment was entirely over. It was time for a very public execution. The grand ballroom of the Beaumont Luxury Hotel was a spectacular display of unearned corporate triumph. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over 300 of the wealthiest real estate investors in the city. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided flawlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and imported caviar. A live string quartet played a cheerful classical symphony in the corner. The entire room was celebrating the monumental acquisition of my $30 million Brooklyn property. But the man who orchestrated the theft was not on the floor accepting their congratulations. Wyatt was hidden away in the private executive management suite located on the mezzanine level directly above the ballroom. He was locked inside the soundproof office, sweating profusely through his expensive Italian silk shirt. The confident, arrogant titan of industry had completely vanished. He was reduced to a frantic, terrified criminal scrambling for his literal survival. His hands shook violently as he knelt in front of the open biometric wall safe. He was blindly shoving thick banded stacks of $100 bills into the heavy black canvas duffel bag. He grabbed a handful of bearer bonds and a velvet pouch filled with raw, untraceable diamonds, tossing them carelessly on top of the cash. The muffled, joyful sounds of the corporate gala bled through the thick floorboards, mocking his catastrophic failure. Wyatt knew the federal authorities had frozen his digital wealth, but he still believed he had a massive head start. He believed he could empty this shadow vault slip down the private freight elevator to the underground parking garage and drive straight to his chartered jet before anyone even realized he was missing. He desperately zipped the heavy canvas bag shut, the metal teeth catching slightly on the thick fabric. He hoisted the bag over his shoulder, feeling the heavy, comforting weight of his escape fund. He wiped a thick layer of cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. He needed to make a brief appearance. He needed to step out onto the mezzanine balcony and raise a glass to the investors below just long enough to maintain the illusion of victory. If he disappeared without a word, his financial backers would immediately panic and alert the authorities. He took a deep, ragged breath, straightened his silk tie, and forced his facial muscles to form a relaxed, confident smile. He pushed open the heavy oak door of the management office and walked out onto the glass-paneled VIP balcony overlooking the massive ballroom. He looked down at the sea of wealthy elites who had blindly trusted him with their fortunes. He raised his hand to signal the waiters to pour the final toast. Before Wyatt could utter a single word, the massive 12-foot mahogany doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom swung wide open with a deafening, echoing crash. The heavy wooden doors slammed violently against the marble walls. The sheer force of the impact instantly cut through the cheerful chatter. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing, the cellist dragging his bow across the strings in a harsh, discordant screech. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. 300 heads turned simultaneously toward the entrance. The room fell into a dead, absolute silence. I walked through the doorway. I did not look like a frail, confused man suffering from advanced dementia. I did not look like a broken patient who had spent the last 48 hours locked inside a padded isolation cell. I wore a masterfully tailored navy blue wool suit that draped perfectly across my shoulders. My posture was rigid and commanding. My shoes clicked sharply and rhythmically against the polished marble floor. I carried my vintage leather briefcase in my right hand, gripping it with the quiet, terrifying authority of a forensic accountant who had come to collect a massive debt. Many of the older investors in the room recognized me instantly. I had spent 40 years auditing their firms, dismantling their competitors, and commanding their absolute respect. They gasped in genuine shock. Whispers rippled rapidly through the wealthy crowd like a sudden electrical current. They had all been told by Wyatt that I was permanently institutionalized, my mind completely gone. Yet here I was standing before them, radiating absolute undeniable clarity. Up on the mezzanine balcony, Wyatt looked down at the entrance. The fake confident smile completely melted off his face. His eyes widened to impossible proportions. The heavy black canvas duffel bag slipped off his shoulder and hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud. He was completely paralyzed with a primal, suffocating fear. His brain simply could not process the reality standing in the center of the ballroom. He had personally locked me inside Sunset Pines. He had paid a corrupt doctor $30,000 to throw away the key. He had legally seized my property and stolen my entire legacy just hours ago. But the ghost of his crime had just walked through the front door wearing a bespoke suit and looking directly up at him. I stopped in the center of the room. I slowly lifted my chin and locked my eyes perfectly onto Wyatt. I did not scream. I did not show an ounce of anger. I simply offered him a cold, empty smile that promised his absolute destruction. The terrifying reality of my presence finally shattered Wyatt's paralysis. His fear instantly boiled over into sheer, unfiltered panic. He gripped the glass railing of the balcony so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He leaned over the edge and screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with desperate hysteria. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me. He ordered the hotel security team to apprehend me immediately. He shouted to the confused crowd that I was a highly dangerous delusional psychiatric patient who had violently escaped a maximum security ward. He screamed that I was suffering from aggressive hallucinations and demanded that they throw the crazy old man out into the street before I hurt somebody. The wealthy investors shrank back, their confusion turning into cautious fear as Wyatt continued his frantic screaming demands from above. 4 large security guards wearing matching black suits and earpieces immediately broke away from the perimeter of the room. They moved swiftly and aggressively through the parted crowd, unhooking the heavy batons from their belts, zeroing in on my position. They expected me to run. They expected me to panic or put up a chaotic, violent struggle like a true psychiatric patient. I did absolutely nothing of the sort. I did not flinch. I did not break my confident stride. I simply turned away from the balcony and walked purposefully toward the front of the grand ballroom. I moved with such absolute unyielding authority that the security guards actually hesitated, confused by my total lack of fear. I reached the short set of velvet-lined stairs leading up to the main presentation stage. I walked up the steps, my leather shoes echoing loudly over the sound system. A massive gold-plated microphone stood on a heavy iron stand in the center of the stage, previously prepared for Wyatt's grand victory speech. I stepped directly up to the microphone. The security guards rushed the stage, their hands reaching out to grab my shoulders and drag me away. I calmly raised my left hand, a simple, universally commanding gesture that forced them to freeze in their tracks just inches away from me. I leaned intimately close to the microphone. I looked past the guards, past the hundreds of shocked investors, and stared straight up at the sweating, trembling coward on the balcony. It was time to pull the pin on the financial grenade I had brought into his pristine, luxurious world. I tapped the gold-plated microphone once. The sharp, heavy thud echoed through the grand ballroom, commanding the absolute attention of every single billionaire, hedge fund manager, and private equity director in the room. The security guards remained frozen in place on the stage, utterly bewildered by my complete lack of resistance and the commanding aura I projected. Up on the mezzanine balcony, Wyatt was hyperventilating, his hands frantically gripping the glass railing as he watched his absolute worst nightmare unfold in real time. I did not waste my breath complaining about the padded cell he locked me in. I did not seek the sympathy of the crowd for the straitjacket or the fabricated dementia diagnosis. Sympathy is a currency reserved for victims, and I was not a victim. I was the executioner. I cleared my throat and spoke with the clear, unyielding projection of a man who had spent 4 decades dominating hostile corporate boardrooms. I formally welcomed the esteemed guests to the Beaumont Luxury Hotel. I thanked them for gathering to celebrate the latest massive acquisition by Wyatt's commercial development firm. I saw the deep confusion rippling through the wealthy crowd. These men and women had just been told by their host that I was violently insane, yet I was standing before them delivering a perfectly articulated, highly sophisticated financial address. I told the audience that I completely understood why they were celebrating tonight. I laid out the exact figures for them. I detailed the $30 million valuation of the prime commercial real estate in downtown Brooklyn. I explained the highly aggressive, legally questionable eminent domain maneuver Wyatt utilized to seize the property from my estate for a mere fraction of its actual worth. I praised his sheer audacity. I told the investors that on paper this looked like the most brilliant real estate transaction of the decade. I watched the wealthy men in their tailored tuxedos nodding slowly, their initial fear morphing into greedy agreement. They loved the numbers. They loved the ruthless efficiency of a corporate steal. They believed I was simply a defeated old man publicly conceding my financial loss to a superior rival. Wyatt stared down at me from the balcony, his jaw clenched tight, completely incapable of understanding why I was validating his fraudulent victory to his own financial backers. But forensic accounting is the ultimate art of misdirection. You build the solid foundation of undeniable facts before you drop the heavy hammer of consequence. I paused, letting the silence stretch out over the crowd, ensuring every single ear was hanging on my next word. I looked directly up at Wyatt and told him the validation portion of my speech was officially over. I gripped the sides of the wooden podium. I raised my voice, allowing the sharp cutting edge of reality to slice through the golden, celebratory glow of the ballroom. I publicly congratulated Wyatt on successfully acquiring the physical dirt in Brooklyn. But I told him that in his desperate, greedy rush to steal my legacy, he had failed to conduct a proper forensic audit of the holding company tied to that specific deed. I explained to the silent room that 20 years ago I quarantined a massive toxic liability inside that exact corporate structure. I revealed the dark history of the property, detailing the severe environmental dumping and aggressive corporate tax evasion committed by the previous owners in the early 1980s. I explained that I had legally shielded that liability within my offshore trust, keeping it completely dormant as long as the property remained strictly under my name. The investors in the crowd suddenly stopped nodding. The arrogant smiles vanished completely from their faces. The seasoned financial sharks in the room immediately recognized the metallic scent of blood in the water. I looked at the crowd and delivered the fatal blow. I announced that the moment Wyatt forced the state to transfer the deed to his development firm this afternoon, that protective offshore shield instantly shattered. I declared with absolute certainty that by taking legal ownership of the Brooklyn property, Wyatt had voluntarily and irrevocably absorbed a $15 million federal tax lien. The words struck the room like a physical shockwave. I did not stop there. I explained that the Internal Revenue Service and the Environmental Protection Agency were already auditing his firm at this very second. I told the investors that this massive federal debt carried 40 years of compounding interest and severe environmental penalties. Because Wyatt's firm was heavily leveraged and bleeding cash, this sudden, inescapable $15 million liability was not just a minor setback. It was an instant, catastrophic death sentence. I looked up at the balcony again. I told Wyatt that his entire corporate empire was legally bankrupt as of 3 hours ago. I informed him that the private equity bridge loan he secured this afternoon had already been intercepted and permanently frozen by the United States Department of Justice. He had absolutely zero operating capital. He could not pay his contractors, he could not pay his defense lawyers, and he could not pay out a single dividend to the people standing in this very room. He had not stolen a gold mine. He had stolen a fully armed financial bomb, and he was holding it directly against his chest when it detonated. The reaction of the crowd was instantaneous and violently chaotic. The carefully maintained etiquette of the high society gala completely disintegrated in a matter of seconds. 300 of the wealthiest investors in the city erupted into a frenzy of pure, unadulterated panic. Men dropped their crystal champagne flutes, the glass shattering loudly against the polished marble floor. Women shrieked as their husbands frantically pulled out their smartphones, desperately trying to call their private brokers to liquidate their shares in Wyatt's firm. They realized with horrifying clarity that their own fortunes were deeply tied to a man who was about to be obliterated by the federal government. The ballroom transformed into a loud, aggressive mob. Several major shareholders began shouting angrily up at the balcony, demanding answers, demanding their money back, calling Wyatt a thief and a massive fraud. The magnificent corporate victory celebration had become a brutal public lynching of his reputation. Up on the mezzanine, the reality of his total destruction finally broke Wyatt's mind. The polished, arrogant real estate developer vanished entirely, leaving behind a frantic, cornered animal. He could not escape quietly with his duffel bag anymore. His investors were blocking the exits, and his entire life was burning to the ground in front of the entire city. Wyatt let out a guttural, terrifying scream of pure rage. He vaulted over the top of the glass mezzanine railing. He did not care about the sheer drop. He landed heavily on the grand sweeping staircase leading down to the ballroom floor, his knees buckling slightly upon impact. He scrambled to his feet, his expensive Italian suit tearing at the seams. He shoved past his own panicked investors, throwing wealthy men and women out of his way with violent force. He lunged toward the presentation stage, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his face twisted into a mask of absolute homicidal fury. He screamed my name, saliva flying from his mouth, swearing he was going to kill me with his bare hands. He pushed past the confused security guard, sprinting directly at the microphone podium where I stood calmly waiting. I did not step back. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I watched the ruined man charge at me with the desperate violence of a cornered rat. He was mere inches away from tackling me to the hardwood floor, fully prepared to commit murder in front of 300 witnesses. But before his outstretched hands could even touch my suit jacket, the heavy wooden doors at the side entrances of the ballroom burst open with deafening force. The heavy wooden doors at the side entrances of the grand ballroom burst open with a deafening, splintering crash that completely drowned out Wyatt's homicidal screams. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical gear and heavy Kevlar body armor swarmed into the luxurious golden-lit space. They moved with absolute military precision, their weapons raised and their tactical flashlights cutting sharply through the dim lighting of the high society gala. Special Agent Miller led the vanguard, his gold shield held high above his head as he shouted for every single person in the room to get down and keep their hands visible. The wealthy elites of the city, the very billionaires and hedge fund managers who had just been demanding their investments back, now scrambled in absolute, unadulterated terror. They dove behind the silk-covered banquet tables, dropping their crystal glasses and expensive jewelry to the polished marble floor to avoid the federal sweep. Wyatt was mere inches away from me. I could literally feel the heat of his ragged, frantic breath and see the violently pulsing vein in his neck. He had his hands raised, his fingers curled into claws, fully prepared to wrap his hands around my throat and strangle me in a fit of primal rage. But the thunderous, booming command of the federal agents shattered his violent trance instantly. He froze entirely suspended in midair as the overwhelming reality of the federal raid crashed down upon his shoulders. He slowly turned his head toward the side entrances. He saw the tactical team systematically securing the exits. He saw the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers reflecting off the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the luxury hotel. He realized in a fraction of a second that there was absolutely no escape. He was completely surrounded by the United States government. The hotel security guards, who had been rushing the stage to apprehend me, instantly dropped their batons and threw their hands into the air, immediately recognizing the supreme authority of the federal badge. I did not move a single muscle. I stood perfectly still behind the gold-plated microphone, my hands resting calmly on the wooden podium. I watched the violent, aggressive fire completely die out of Wyatt's eyes, replaced instantly by the hollow, sickening realization that his life as a free man was officially over. Two massive federal agents sprinted up the velvet-lined stairs of the presentation stage. They did not treat Wyatt like a respected corporate executive or a wealthy VIP. They treated him exactly like a dangerous, fleeing felon. One agent grabbed Wyatt roughly by the collar of his ruined Italian suit and brutally swept his legs out from under him. Wyatt hit the hardwood stage floor with a sickening thud, the breath violently expelled from his lungs in a sharp gasp. The second agent drove his heavy tactical knee squarely into Wyatt's back, pinning him firmly against the wooden boards. Wyatt squirmed and kicked, but the agents expertly wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the microphone, broadcasting his ultimate physical defeat to the entire ballroom. Special Agent Miller walked slowly up the stairs, holstering his weapon. He stood over the broken man and pulled out a physical federal warrant. In a loud, authoritative voice that carried to every dark corner of the silent room, Miller read Wyatt his Miranda rights. He formally charged the billionaire developer with multiple federal counts of wire fraud, interstate money laundering, criminal conspiracy, and severe elder abuse. Wyatt was completely stripped of his dignity and his power. The polished, arrogant predator who had gleefully mocked me inside a padded isolation cell just hours ago was completely gone. Wyatt broke down into pathetic, hysterical sobs. He pressed his face against the dusty floorboards, crying uncontrollably, begging the agents not to send him to federal prison. He babbled incoherently, trying to blame his corporate lawyers, trying to blame the corrupt city zoning commissioner, desperately throwing absolutely anyone he could think of under the bus to save himself. It was a miserable, humiliating display of absolute cowardice. The wealthy investors who had worshipped him just 30 minutes ago now watched him writhe on the floor with unfiltered disgust. Some even pulled out their smartphones to record the pathetic spectacle. They saw the true measure of the man they had trusted with their fortunes. He was not a titan of industry. He was a weak, pathetic fraud who wept like a frightened child the exact moment his stolen power was stripped away. I looked down at him from the podium. I did not offer him a single word of pity or compassion. I simply watched the federal agents haul him roughly to his feet, his expensive suit stained with tears and humiliation. Before the agents could drag Wyatt down the stairs and out to the waiting cruisers, a sudden commotion erupted at the rear of the grand ballroom. A woman forcefully shoved her way past the federal blockade at the main entrance, her breathing ragged and her appearance completely disheveled. It was my daughter, Kendra. She had fled Wyatt's corporate office and desperately tracked him down to the gala, terrified that the underground syndicate was already closing in on her location. She burst into the room, her designer white blazer deeply wrinkled and her expensive makeup smeared terribly across her cheeks from crying. She froze the exact moment she saw the tactical agents securing the perimeter. Her wide, terrified eyes locked onto the presentation stage. She saw her husband standing in heavy steel handcuffs surrounded by federal investigators weeping openly. In that instant, Kendra understood that her absolute final chance of escaping the country with Wyatt's emergency cash had completely evaporated. The syndicate was going to find her, and she had absolutely no money to pay them. Pure suffocating panic completely overrode her logic and her pride. She sprinted down the center aisle of the ballroom, dodging the overturned chairs and discarded champagne flutes. She bypassed the federal agents, ran up the velvet stairs, and threw herself violently onto the hardwood floor directly at my feet. She wrapped her arms tightly around my legs, sobbing with a theatrical, desperate intensity. She buried her face in my trousers and began to scream her fabricated innocence to the entire room. She cried that she had absolutely no idea what Wyatt was planning. She swore on her life that Wyatt was a physically abusive monster who had threatened her and violently forced her to sign the fake medical guardianship papers. She played the helpless, terrified victim flawlessly, begging me to forgive her for being so blind. But her fake apologies rapidly turned into a frantic, literal plea for her life. She looked up at me, her eyes wild with pure terror, and begged me to access my offshore trusts immediately. She screamed that she needed $3 million transferred tonight, or the loan sharks would butcher her in the street. She begged her father to save her from the monsters she owed. I looked down at the woman who had happily sold my freedom and my sanity to pay for her secret vices. She honestly thought a few desperate tears and a fabricated story could erase her monumental betrayal. She was about to learn a very brutal, unforgiving lesson about consequence. I looked down at the woman clutching my tailored trousers. Kendra was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Her tears soaked the fabric of my suit. She wailed with such manufactured agony that a stranger might have actually believed her. She painted Wyatt as a violent, manipulative monster who had held her hostage in her own marriage. She spun a frantic narrative claiming she had secretly tried to hire lawyers to free me from Sunset Pines, but was blocked by Wyatt's deep pockets. She begged for the $3 million, framing it as a ransom for her very survival. The entire grand ballroom watched this pathetic display. The wealthy investors, still reeling from the financial bloodbath, stared at the weeping daughter of the man who had just destroyed their portfolios. On the floor below the stage, Wyatt let out a weak, bitter laugh. He was securely handcuffed and pinned by federal agents, but he still found the breath to curse his wife for her spectacular hypocrisy. Special Agent Miller stepped forward, his hand resting cautiously on his utility belt, observing the domestic dispute to determine if Kendra was truly a victim or an active threat. I did not reach down to comfort her. I did not stroke her hair or offer a single word of paternal reassurance. I simply stood like a statue of solid marble. I let her exhaust her supply of fake tears. I let her spin her web of lies until she was completely trapped inside it. When her frantic apologies finally dissolved into ragged, hyperventilating gasps, I reached slowly into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not pull out a bank authorization token to save her from the underground syndicate. My fingers closed around the cold, hard plastic of the micro-digital audio recorder that Mateo had smuggled out of the psychiatric ward. I pulled the tiny black device out and held it up to the light of the crystal chandeliers. Kendra stopped crying the exact moment she recognized the device. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. I did not say a single word to her. I stepped back up to the wooden presentation podium. I held the small black recorder directly against the mesh grill of the gold-plated microphone. I pressed the play button. The highly sensitive professional-grade sound system of the Beaumont Luxury Hotel instantly amplified the recording, blasting the audio through dozens of massive speakers strategically placed around the grand ballroom. The pristine, undeniable audio of Kendra's screaming confession filled the cavernous space. Every single person in the room heard the harsh, vicious tone of her true voice. They heard her openly admit to the massive gambling debt. They heard her explicitly confess to paying a $30,000 cash bribe to Dr. Hayes to fabricate my aggressive dementia diagnosis. The audio captured her screaming that my stubborn refusal to sell the land naturally was going to get her killed, and that she had to lock me in a padded cell to steal my property. The pure malice and naked greed in her recorded voice completely shattered the delicate weeping victim facade she had just constructed on the stage. The wealthy investors who had felt a brief flicker of pity for her a moment ago now looked at her with absolute unfiltered revulsion. They heard a daughter violently demanding her father's fortune simply because she felt entitled to his hard-earned wealth. Down on the floor, Wyatt smiled a bloody, broken smile, taking a sick satisfaction in watching his wife burn right alongside him. Special Agent Miller's expression hardened into a mask of pure professional fury. He realized he was not just looking at a coerced wife. He was looking at the primary architect of the entire criminal conspiracy. The recording continued to play, detailing her ruthless instructions to keep me locked away indefinitely. Every single lie she had just sobbed into my trousers was violently dismantled by her own recorded words. She had provided the federal government with a flawless, irrefutable confession to federal wire fraud conspiracy, elder abuse, and the bribery of licensed medical professionals. The recording finally clicked off, leaving a ringing, heavy silence in the ballroom. Kendra slowly released her grip on my legs. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees across the polished hardwood of the stage, her expensive white blazer scuffing against the floorboards. She looked around the room, her eyes darting wildly, desperately searching for a single sympathetic face. She found absolutely none. The federal agents were already moving into position, completely cutting off any potential escape route. She looked back up at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, completely unable to formulate a new lie. She had played her final card and lost absolutely everything. I looked down at her. I did not feel an ounce of sorrow. I did not feel the agonizing heartbreak of a father losing a child. That specific grief had already burned away during my 2 days in the isolation cell. I felt nothing but the cold, calculating satisfaction of a perfectly executed audit. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to hers, and spoke in a quiet, deadly tone that carried effortlessly through the silent room. I told her that she canceled my flight, so I canceled her future. I turned my back on her completely. I picked up my vintage leather briefcase from the podium. I did not wait to watch the authorities put their hands on her. I walked gracefully down the velvet-lined stairs, my shoes clicking rhythmically against the floor. Behind me, Special Agent Miller barked a sharp command. 2 female federal agents rushed the stage, grabbing Kendra roughly by the arms and dragging her to her feet. She began to scream my name. She shrieked hysterically, begging her daddy to come back, begging me not to let them take her away, pleading for the money to save her from the syndicate. Her desperate cries echoed off the marble walls, mingling with Wyatt's pathetic sobbing. I did not turn around. I did not break my confident stride. The federal agents clamped the heavy steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists, officially arresting her as a primary co-conspirator. I walked straight through the parted sea of wealthy investors, straight out the massive wooden doors of the grand ballroom, and left the burning ruins of their fraudulent empire entirely behind me. The trap had executed perfectly, and the parasites were finally destroyed. I sat in the heavy leather chair across from Gregory Pierce. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his downtown law firm, illuminating the floating dust motes in the quiet room. It had been exactly 12 hours since I walked out of the Beaumont Luxury Hotel. The city was already buzzing with the explosive news. Wyatt's spectacular public arrest was plastered across the front page of every major financial publication in New York. The headlines screamed about the sudden collapse of his real estate empire and the shocking federal raid. Gregory sat behind his massive oak desk, meticulously sifting through a thick stack of federal court documents. He did not offer me a celebratory drink. We were both seasoned professionals who understood that the true victory was never the dramatic arrest. The true victory was the flawless execution of the legal aftermath. Gregory handed me a pristine white folder bearing the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. It contained the preliminary asset seizure reports. I opened the folder and read the bold black text. It was a beautiful, devastating testament to the ultimate power of forensic accounting. I had spent my entire life tracking the lies of corrupt men. But this specific report was my absolute masterpiece. Every single bank account Wyatt thought he had perfectly hidden was completely exposed and permanently frozen. His offshore trusts in the Cayman Islands, his hidden corporate safety nets, and even his personal emergency funds were securely locked within the federal vault. Gregory leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. He told me the federal prosecutor was aggressively pushing for maximum consecutive sentences on all federal charges. The sheer volume of irrefutable evidence we provided left the defense attorneys absolutely paralyzed. There would be no lenient plea deals. There would be no quiet settlements. Wyatt and Kendra were trapped in a brutal legal meat grinder of their own making. I closed the heavy folder and rested it on the polished mahogany desk. The intense adrenaline of the past 3 days had finally faded from my bloodstream, leaving behind a sharp, profound clarity. I did not feel the typical fleeting rush of vindication. I simply felt the heavy, quiet satisfaction of restoring absolute order to a chaotic, corrupted system. The dangerous parasites who had tried to feed on my legacy were officially severed. The systematic dismantling of Wyatt's corporate empire was remarkably swift and completely merciless. The Internal Revenue Service did not hesitate for a single second. Armed with the massive $15 million tax lien triggered by his forced property transfer, federal auditors descended upon his commercial real estate firm like a swarm of starving locusts. They immediately liquidated his active construction sites across the city, auctioned off his expensive heavy machinery for pennies on the dollar, and permanently revoked his state contractor licenses. Wyatt's firm was entirely erased from the commercial registry by the end of the week. He was currently sitting in a maximum security federal holding facility, stripped of his tailored Italian suits and his boundless arrogance, facing 20 hard years for federal wire fraud. My daughter Kendra faced an even darker, more terrifying reality. She was officially indicted as a primary co-conspirator in the medical kidnapping and the corporate theft. Because of the undeniable audio recording I provided directly to the FBI, her high-priced defense lawyers completely abandoned her case. She was facing a mandatory 10-year federal prison sentence with absolutely no chance of early parole. But the American legal system was actually the least of her immediate terrors. The violent underground gambling syndicate she owed $3 million to did not magically forgive her debt just because she was incarcerated. Gregory informed me that the syndicate had already utilized their own shadow networks to freeze her personal accounts and place a heavy illegal lien on her remaining luxury vehicles. She was ruined financially and socially, completely abandoned by the high society friends she had so desperately tried to impress. As for my $30 million Brooklyn property, the legal recovery was entirely seamless. The state judge reviewed the FBI evidence of extreme coercion and immediately nullified the corrupt eminent domain auction. The physical deed was officially restored to my offshore trust, completely wiping away the toxic tax liability and sealing it back in the vault. But I did not stop at simply recovering my own stolen property. Wyatt had caused me severe emotional distress, physically imprisoned me, and forced me to incur massive legal fees. Gregory filed a brutal, overwhelming civil suit against Wyatt's remaining personal estate. We aggressively liquidated his luxury penthouse, his imported sports cars, and his private art collection to cover every single penny of my attorney fees. I ensured that Wyatt would eventually leave federal prison in 2 decades with absolutely nothing but the cheap clothes on his back. The ashes of their empire were scattered completely to the wind. Late that evening, I returned to my quiet Brooklyn brownstone. The heavy oak front door still bore the faint scratches where the armed police officers had battered it to drag me to the psychiatric asylum. I stood in the grand foyer and listened to the absolute suffocating silence of the massive house. The biometric scanners Wyatt had installed were completely deactivated and physically removed from the walls. I was no longer a prisoner in my own home, but the freedom felt incredibly heavy. I walked slowly up the hardwood stairs to my master bedroom. The shattered doorframe had already been repaired by a private contractor, erasing the last physical evidence of the violent betrayal. I pulled my vintage leather suitcase from the top shelf of my closet and laid it gently on the center of the large bed. I carefully packed my tailored wool suits, my silk ties, and my polished Oxfords. I was finally preparing for the exact same trip to Chicago I had tried to take days ago. But as I methodically folded my shirts, the harsh, undeniable reality of my situation settled deeply into my aging bones. I had successfully destroyed the parasites who tried to ruin me. I had fiercely protected my vast wealth and permanently secured my financial legacy. I had proven to the entire city that my mind was sharper and infinitely more dangerous than any young, arrogant predator. But the ultimate cost of that brilliant victory was absolute isolation. At 69 years old, I was completely alone in the world. My beloved wife, Corinne, was gone. The man I had welcomed into my family as a son was a convicted, ruined felon. And my only daughter, the child I had raised and protected my entire life, had eagerly tried to throw me into a padded concrete cell to pay for her own selfish greed. I closed the heavy leather suitcase and secured the brass clasps. The loud metallic click echoed harshly through the empty bedroom. I walked over to the large bay window and looked out at the glittering city skyline. I had millions of dollars safely locked in the bank and a brilliant, undefeated legal mind, but I had absolutely no family left to share it with. I was an untouchable island of wealth floating in a dark sea of betrayal. I picked up the heavy suitcase by its worn leather handle. I had a morning flight to catch. I needed to finish the corporate board meeting in Chicago, but the daunting question of what I would do with the rest of my solitary life weighed heavily on my mind as I turned off the bedroom light and walked down the dark stairs. The brutal war was officially over, but the resulting peace felt remarkably like a graveyard. 6 months later, the crisp morning air of November felt remarkably different from that fateful Tuesday in May. I walked through the heavy sliding glass doors of Terminal 4 at John F. Kennedy International Airport. The fluorescent lights hummed above me with the exact same frequency. The highly polished tile floors reflected the bright overhead lamps just as they had half a year ago. I wore a custom-tailored charcoal wool suit, a crisp white shirt, and carried my vintage leather briefcase firmly in my right hand. I walked directly toward the premium first-class check-in counter. This was the exact geographical coordinate where my own flesh and blood had ambushed me with private medical handlers. I stood on the very tile where Wyatt had proudly waved a fabricated court order declaring me mentally incompetent. I approached the sleek desk. A young airline agent smiled warmly and asked for my identification. I reached into my inner breast pocket and pulled out my perfectly valid United States passport. I handed it across the counter. The agent swiped the small booklet through the electronic reader. My heart maintained a steady, disciplined rhythm, but a dark shadow of a memory flickered in my mind. I remembered the glaring red warning banner from 6 months ago. I remembered the patronizing security officers, the feeling of the straitjacket, and the horrifying realization that I was entirely trapped by the people I trusted. I watched the agent type efficiently on her keyboard. She did not frown. She did not call for airport security or tell me a medical freeze had locked my life away. She simply smiled again, hit a single button on her terminal, and handed me a freshly printed boarding pass. The ghost of the medical kidnapping was completely exorcised. I took my ticket, thanked her politely, and walked away from the counter, a completely free man. I moved through the expedited security checkpoint without a single delay or sideways glance. I was not a confused elderly patient wandering the terminal. I was Harlan, a master forensic accountant, and I had completely reclaimed the narrative of my own life. I made my way to the exclusive first-class airline lounge and found a quiet leather wingback chair overlooking the bustling tarmac. I ordered a black coffee, opened my tablet, and reviewed the final legal summaries Gregory Pierce had emailed me the night before. The news cycle had long since moved past the spectacular fiery collapse of Wyatt's real estate empire, but the federal legal system had finally finished sweeping up the ashes. Just 3 weeks ago, a federal judge handed down the official sentencing. Wyatt had stood in a federal courtroom permanently stripped of his expensive Italian suits and his boundless arrogance. He wore a standard-issue khaki prison uniform and heavy iron shackles around his ankles. He cried again during his sentencing hearing, begging the court for leniency, claiming the massive debt clouded his judgment. The judge showed absolutely no mercy to a man who weaponized the medical system to steal from a defenseless elder. Wyatt received a mandatory minimum of 15 years in a medium-security federal penitentiary in Pennsylvania. The arrogant billionaire developer who once dreamed of putting his name in massive gold letters on a Brooklyn skyscraper was now a designated inmate number. He spends his days scrubbing cafeteria floors for 40 cents an hour, surrounded by men who do not care about his former wealth. Kendra's fate was equally severe, yet remarkably fitting for her crimes. She tried to leverage her tears one final time during her grand jury testimony, claiming Wyatt had masterminded the entire operation and physically threatened her. But my audio recording was an indestructible wall of truth. Facing a potential 30-year sentence if she took the case to trial, my daughter cowardly accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to felony conspiracy, wire fraud, and severe elder abuse. She received a 10-year sentence in a women's federal correctional facility. Federal prison effectively shielded her from the violent underground gambling syndicate she owed millions to, but her financial ruin was absolute. She was forced to declare total devastating bankruptcy. Her designer blazers, her luxury sports cars, and her expensive jewelry were seized by the government and auctioned off to pay federal restitution. The woman who believed she was entitled to my $30 million fortune now works 6 days a week in a steaming hot prison laundry room, washing the stained uniforms of her fellow inmates. The toxic parasites were entirely removed from the host. But I did not simply keep the Brooklyn property to enrich myself. Wealth without purpose is just a different kind of prison. I instructed Gregory Pierce to facilitate a clean, highly publicized commercial sale of the unencumbered land. Without the toxic tax liability, the property sold to a legitimate international developer for $32 million. I took every single penny of that equity and established the Corinne and Harlan Educational Trust. It is a massive, impenetrable scholarship foundation designed exclusively for brilliant, underprivileged African-American youths across the country. I am currently funding the college tuition for the next generation of sharp, ruthless legal minds and forensic accountants. I am building an army of intelligent young men and women who will spend their careers dismantling the exact kind of corporate predators Wyatt tried to be. I took the weapon they tried to kill me with and forged it into a permanent legacy of empowerment for my community. A soft chime echoed through the luxury lounge, announcing the final boarding call for my flight to Chicago. I closed my tablet, finished my black coffee, and picked up my heavy leather briefcase. I walked down the long carpeted concourse toward my designated gate. I handed my boarding pass to the flight attendant and walked down the enclosed jet bridge, feeling the slight mechanical bounce beneath my polished shoes. I stepped onto the aircraft and settled into my spacious first-class seat by the large window. The lead flight attendant approached me with a warm, genuine smile and offered a pre-departure beverage. I did not ask for sparkling water or coffee. I requested a glass of their finest vintage champagne. She returned a moment later and placed the crystal flute on the small wooden tray beside me. I picked up the glass and watched the golden bubbles rise rapidly to the surface. I looked out the thick glass window at the sprawling expanse of the airport tarmac and the bright, cloudless morning sky beyond it. The massive jet engines beneath the wings began to hum, producing a deep, powerful vibration that signaled forward momentum. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the cold champagne. The taste was sharp, crisp, and incredibly victorious. I leaned my head back against the plush headrest and allowed myself a rare moment of deep, unfiltered reflection. The brutal war I had fought over the past 6 months had exacted a heavy, undeniable toll on my soul. I had lost my only daughter to the blinding poison of greed. I had lost the man I once proudly welcomed into my family. I had severed the absolute last remaining blood ties I possessed in this world. But I realized with absolute clarity that blood is nothing more than simple biology. True family is built on a solid foundation of unyielding respect, genuine loyalty, and protective love. I had shed a heavy toxic illusion, and in doing so, I had saved my own life. I did not have a family waiting for me in Chicago, but I had something infinitely more valuable. I had kept my razor-sharp mind completely intact. I had successfully defended my hard-earned dignity against the vultures who sought to strip it away. And above all else, I had secured my absolute uncompromising freedom. The aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its steady, powerful taxi toward the main runway. I closed my eyes and listened to the roar of the engines. The turbulence of the past was entirely behind me. The ultimate victory of the silent adjustment was completely finalized. I was Harlan. I was 69 years old, and I was finally flying exactly where I wanted to go. The greatest lesson I learned is that true power never needs to shout. Wyatt and Kendra relied on loud arrogance and the assumption that age equals weakness. They believed that by stripping away my physical freedom, they had stripped away my power. But the most dangerous weapon anyone can wield is a quiet, patient mind. Real wealth is not just property, it is the discipline you build over a lifetime. If you have ever been underestimated by those who mistook your silence for surrender, share your story in the comments below. Please hit like and subscribe for more life lessons.